I almost kicked my coffee over before we went live, folks. That would have been terrible. I need a Lenin sticker. I was thinking today, I always play this guitar, and I've had my Bernie sticker on it since I worked for the campaign 2.5 years ago before I became a Marxist, or actually as I became a Marxist. But now that I'm doing an episode on Lenin's imperialism and reading about all the social democrat opportunists who side with imperialism, now I just really wish I had a sticker of Lenin instead of Bernie. You know what I mean? Hi, Eddie. Hello, comrade. Petamilo. ¿Cómo se dice tu nombre? If it's a Spanish name. If not, I'm sorry. I just see the double L in there, and I assume it's ya. Spanish, Espanol. That song's hard. I'm going to try a different song. Hi, comrade. Hello, Robert. Welcome to the stream. Welcome to the stream, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We got quite a few viewers in here already. I'm #pumped. Late night stream, trying it out. At least it's late for me. It's 9 o'clock here in the Midwest, Central Time. But I, usually stream during the day. Usually stream before wrestling practice. Usually too tired afterwards. But today, it's Friday. Want to try out the late night stream, see if people like this time. If this is a time that works well for some people, we'll try and do more late night streams, especially on the weekends. So, yeah. Jacob, what's up, buddy? Hey, Eddie, I found some Korean pop song that was made by comrades from and for the DPRK. It's an absolute banger. Well, I've got a whole show planned today. Whole show planned out, but we gotta watch this, right? Like, that video sounds awesome, and like, what a great way to start the stream too. I honestly can't think of a better way to start the stream. I just got to pull it up here, which is taking me a second. I also have to share my screen. We will watch that, though. Hey, everybody. Hello, Where Pilgrim. Welcome back. Welcome back. You're always here, as is Petamillo. Manny Wyatt, what's going on, Eddie? What's going on, Manny? How are you? I hope y'all are ready to talk about Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, because I got quite the stream plan today to talk about this. All these liberals and social democrats are pro-imperialists. It's just these scumbags prefer low-intensity warfare, sanctions, drone strikes, proxies, internal subversions. Yeah, hybrid war. I think hybrid war is the best concept for it. That's the concept created by Vijay Prashad to describe all the various, covert and not covert techniques that the U.S. uses to create regime change. And for those who don't know, right now I'm working on a Venezuela book. I'm going to write a book about U.S. imperialism in Venezuela, or I'm in the process of writing it. It's done a lot of research for it already. And I have the whole outline done. I'm just extending some parts and doing some more research. But as I'm looking at Venezuela more closely than I ever have, which I did my undergraduate thesis on Venezuela, but now, 2-3 years later, I have a better understanding of Marxism, better understanding of Leninism, of imperialism, of capitalism in general. So I want to go back and take an even deeper look at Venezuela, extend my thesis into a book. But long story short, sorry to ramble about the book I'm writing. I'm really excited. But the U.S. uses hybrid war against Venezuela. It's not just one technique. It's not just one thing they do to to destabilize this country. Because sometimes you hear like, oh, sanctions, that doesn't seem that bad. Oh, they recognize Juan Guaido, that doesn't seem that bad. Oh, they fund the opposition, that doesn't seem that bad. You know, in isolation, these things don't seem that bad, or you don't see how it could put Venezuela into poverty, you know, or prevent them from constructing socialism. But combined together, the hybrid of these various attacks are what make them so devastating. Like, by example, with Venezuela, the U.S. Sanctions caused a bunch of their assets to get frozen globally. So Venezuela is engaging in trade or whatever with other countries. So other countries are hanging on to their resources. The U.S. sanctions prevent countries from trading with Venezuela. So they place sanctions when Venezuelan commodities are overseas. And then the U.S.'s allies have just frozen Venezuela's assets, just said, you're not getting this back. We're not going to trade with you anymore. And we're just going to keep all the resources that you were trading with us before. The UK did this with a bunch of gold. Countries have done it with their oil in many cases. And then after that, the U.S. declares Guaido the president of Venezuela, legally recognizes him, which a lot of people have laughed at and called a meme. And it is funny, that meme, you know, Juan Guaido is the, you know, the U.S. declares Juan Guaido the president of Taiwan or whatever. You know, they're just going to recognize Juan Guaido as the leader of whatever country they want. But what that did legally was it made it so Venezuela was not an internationally recognized government. Other U.S. allies and U.S. puppet states didn't recognize Venezuela internationally. So if you have a government that's not recognized, you know, it doesn't have the same protections under international law. And all of these countries who had Venezuela's assets sitting in their banks that had been frozen by the sanctions just started siphoning the assets, just started taking them, or giving them either to the Western state apparatus or giving them to oil companies or, you know, various multinationals, like the U.S. did with the oil they intercepted from Iran to Houston, gave it away. I mean, from Iran to Venezuela, they took it to Houston and gave it to multinationals. So it's the combination of the sanctions, you know, and then the declaring Juan Guaido not the president, which was only possible because of millions of dollars that NGOs funneled into the Venezuelan opposition party, which on top of that, when this political and economic crisis and instability is created, the U.S. launches a coup attempt in 2019, an armed violent coup. So it's a hybrid of methods. You know, there's so many different attacks that the U.S. use in conjunction and in cooperation with each other, right? Not in isolation. And they're very strategic with how they do it. So, all right, end rant. That went on longer than I thought. Eric the Bread, what's up, Eric? How are you? You're here on TikTok and YouTube. Wow, what a true comrade that is. What up, folks? What up? Heard Juan Guaido is the new UK PM. That's hilarious. All right, let's get back to the video Jacob sent us. Sorry, Jacob, I got sidetracked. But I'm coming in hot. Oops, y'all are going to see my whole stream plan for today. I don't want that. All right, apparently this is a song. Sorry, let's read what Jacob said. Sup, Midwest people, Iowa City here. Oh, dope, I love Iowa City. Coralville is like my favorite city in the country. Legit. So this is from Jacob. Hey, Eddie, I found this Korean pop song that was made by comrades from and for the DPRK. Absolute banger. So here you go. Let's see. Oops, volume is off. Let me turn my own volume off quick.
백승도동강 새 시대를 열었다 천리만일 기상을 온 세상에 떨치다 옥수가서 빨리 가자 천리와 타고서 700년 기행을 앞당겨 나가자 이야차 공산주의 저기 보인다 이야짝 공산주의 세운 거기 저기 보인다 노동당의 전사를 빛나는 새승리 어서 가자 빨리 가자 천리만 하고서.
That was awesome. I love that song. That is going on my Fight the Power playlist. Yeah, we gotta make it so one day they're teaching kids this song in class, in history class, and they're saying, even at a time when they were demonized by the entire world, when the entire world pretended like the DPRK was this human rights abusing atrocity of a country where everybody just is ruled under the iron fist of Kim Jong-un, who is a sadistic dictator. Even when the entire country is most of the world, or at least the Western world, is propagating this narrative. As the U.S. kills 20% of North Korea's population in the Korean War and then puts them under the most stringent economic sanctions and embargo ever seen in human history, only paralleled by the U.S. embargo on Cuba, or only rivaled by the U.S. embargo on Cuba, occupying half of the Korean peninsula and keeping the North in a state of constant siege. Even as the U.S. is doing that, and the North hangs on to their sovereignty and continues to construct socialism and bring about economic and political independence for their people, even as they're doing that, they're demonized by the corporate press. The corporate press will never call the U.S., who killed 20% of North Korea's population and leveled every building over 2 stories tall in the entire country. The corporate press will never call the country who did that human rights abusers. They'll never even question whether this country is abusing human rights. It's only the target country, because when the target country, the colonized country, takes up arms and fights back, that's when they're abusing human rights. That's when we have to start dropping bombs on them, right? So one day, it's our goal to create a socialist society where, in history class, people are taught about the heroic struggle of the DPRK. Why Coralville, though? It's just strip malls and shit, lol. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I guess my favorite cities or towns are in Colorado, or are places where you can go be in nature. But Coralville is where they have the Extreme Arena, where they host a bunch of Greco-Roman and freestyle wrestling tournaments, like the World Team Trials and stuff, which is what I compete in. So that's my favorite arena to compete in. I just like Coralville for like cutting weight. I just know the city, so I feel comfortable running to cut weight. I know where to get food there. It's mostly a comfort thing when I'm competing in wrestling. And then, I like to go to 30 Hop, this bar, afterwards, after the wrestling tournaments, to celebrate. So, and like this year, one of the competitions, the US Open, which is to qualify for the World Team Trials, was in Las Vegas. So I had to go to Vegas, which was a huge hassle, cut a bunch of weight in the desert. And it was fun, and it's awesome to travel for wrestling, but it just drains you, to be on a plane and stuff. So then after I qualified for the World Team Trials in Vegas, the World Team Trials were in Coralville, which is just like, an hour and a half drive for me. So I'm like, this is awesome compared to Vegas. So that's why I have such a good association with Coralville. Eddie, what do you think about China funding the Duterte regime? So we're gonna get into Lenin's imperialism here soon, but I do want to answer people's questions and interact with the chat a little bit before I go on any more tirades. What do you think about China funding the Duterte regime and sending guns to them to fight the CPP and NPA? Yeah, it's basically the same thing that I always say when people ask me about China's trading with Israel. In that, Palestinian activists and Palestinian socialists don't want Americans to criticize China for that. They don't want Americans to criticize China for trading with Israel, because China has solidarity with Palestine, much more so than the U.S., obviously, who's funding and arming Israel in the occupation. But China has a trade policy of mutual development and complete and total non-interventionism. So they basically say we're never, ever, ever going to mess with your internal affairs or your internal politics. We just want economic and trade policy of mutual development. So this means they don't discriminate with their trade. That means they trade with Israel. That means they trade with Duterte. And yeah, I've heard, accusations that those guns and stuff are used against communists, or the economic benefit that China gives to Israel and Duterte's regime, or maybe Colombia, countries like that are just like right-wing, borderline U.S. imperialist puppet states, if not complete U.S. puppet states, or basically U.S. occupied countries, South Korea. Countries like that, China trades with them, and there's criticism to be made. You could say, don't do that. But, this is how China has built themselves up on the global stage without really angering the U.S. for a long time, right? They allowed a lot of Western investment into their country, allowed capitalists to make a whole bunch of money on China. And now basically the U.S. and the whole world economy is dependent on China. And their trade policy of complete non-interventionism is part of that. And then once you, obviously I would love for China to stop, funding Israel completely, stop trading with Israel. That would be ideal. But that's what the Soviet Union did. They had a selective trade policy and ultimately it didn't work. That's not why the Soviet Union collapsed, but, China has adjusted their foreign policy based on what didn't work in the USSR. And yeah, it just prevents them from becoming a target of imperialism. And for years, it made it look like China wasn't supporting global socialist movements. They say we do not export revolution. We don't help socialist movements. So the Belt and Road Initiative is obviously developing infrastructure in all these countries, developing the proletariat as a class in all these countries. But China's not trying to export revolution in any way. Yeah. And as for Duterte himself, I've seen communists come out in support of him because I think he had some populist reforms and he has support among the workers, which that's definitely something to be analyzed. But his policy of just killing all the drug dealers caused a lot of death and destruction. And that's an actual example of quote unquote authoritarianism, even though the U.S. was literally trying to infiltrate and destabilize his country via the drug trade and via the DEA, which Duterte said, and that's why he's we're going to kill all the drug dealers. But, Mao Zedong during the China Civil War said, we let all of our prisoners of war go. We don't kill any prisoners of war. And that was at a time when they were fighting the Kuomintang, right-wing U.S.-backed nationalists and, who were using terror tactics and stuff like that. So, yeah, I don't think it's the communist opinion to kill for drug offenses. I don't really care that China executed some corrupt dictators a while back. That was just a show we're still a dictatorship of the proletariat, The Philippines. Yeah, I don't know too much about the Philippines. So I got into Duterte a while back just watching a bunch of his speeches and stuff. But, Duterte's daughter is the new VP. Interesting. Okay, I got to go to the bathroom, y'all. And then we'll get into Lenin's imperialism. So enjoy this song, the rest of this song about the DPRK while I pee.
수십년을 하루로 달리어 나간다 군술과 중사의 불길을 높여라 어서 가자 빨리 가자 천리만 타고서 그 손만 내 행복할 나무를 꾸미자 이야차 노동당 깃발 따라 나가자 이야차 노동당 깃발 따라 나가자 이야차
Beautiful. Watch Marxist Paul's video on the Philippines and the revolutionary movement. All right. That would be fun for us to all learn together. And Marxist Paul has some good videos, doesn't he? I like his Socialism 101 series. Obviously, he's a Maoist and we disagree. And the only video I've done responding to Paul is about Russia. And obviously, I disagree with his position. So it makes me just a little bit hesitant to just, throw my support behind him or say I'm sure I'm skeptical going into any of his videos now, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But we can definitely check that out together. Looks like it's 30 minutes long, so that'll probably be a 2 or 3 parter, but we can try to start tonight. All right, let me find my... Where the heck did my stream plan go? I can't do this stream without my plan, y'all. I need a plan. All right, I got it. I have got it. Does anyone know how to join the Discord? You should be able to from the link tree. Did you try the link tree yet? I literally fixed the link tree on the last stream so that it would allow people into the Discord, but I'll make another one. As I was saying on the last stream, the Discord link always dies. It says it's not going to expire, but it always does. And it makes me so mad. Am I on Twitch? Yes, we're actually streaming on Twitch right now. North on the rise, south on the decline. Yeah, we're on Twitch right now at Midwestern Marx. South, yeah. South Korea equals occupied Korea. Facts. Great stream, Eddie. Thank you, David. Great to see you here, buddy. We'll try and have another Zoom, or we'll try and have another Patreon meetup very soon. Very, very soon. This week or next week. Shout out to the Patreon supporters. The two parties of the DPRK in China and the two countries are defending and advancing socialism, their common cause, while frustrating the undisguised hostile policy and military threats of the U.S. DPRK cause. Darn right. Shout out to the DPRK in China in the East. Lady Izdihar, Hakeem, Eddie collab? That would be awesome. I have contacted Hakeem, and he said he's down for that. Lady Izdihar, I'm sure, would be too. Critical support of Marxist Paul? Yeah, I guess we could say that. Critical support. Watch Mojo Top 10 Lies about the DPRK. Okay, yeah, we could definitely watch that too. I do want to get into Lenin's imperialism, though. One sec. I need to take some magnesium to calm myself when we talk about imperialism. Or I'll get too upset. So, I was going through Lenin's imperialism today, and I figured I want to start breaking down quote-unquote simple Marxist theory on stream a lot more. Right, because honestly, I went on vacation with my with my parents recently, and I was kind of surprised, like how much they didn't know about Marxism, even though I'm talking about Marxism every day, and it made me realize how much I take for granted. That I'm just like, oh, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that Marx said that, or everybody knows this principle of Marxism, but something that I realized when I first started out, and I think what helped us get popular originally, was that people really have no idea, right? The working masses are starved of real political and economic education. They're starved of a real analysis of their problems. They're starved of philosophy, the spirit of mind, as Hegel would say. And people are hungry for that. But if you throw a bunch of complicated gobbledygook at people right away, and a bunch of phrases that they don't understand and words they don't understand, you're not going to get anywhere. So I just think we need to hit on the basics a lot more. as a collective and as a project. And I want to do that on TikTok, and I also want to do that on stream. So something I figured I could do is just pick a chapter or two from my favorite works of theory and just talk about, summarize what they say and summarize why they're important. 30 minutes of Marx and Lenin a day keeps the fascists and capitalists away. Exactly, Jacob. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Do you see both conservative and Labour prime minister candidates in the UK want to make it illegal for workers in public service to strike, like rail workers? And like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. We might have a rail strike in the US here coming up, by the way. Their strike authorization ballots just went out. Yeah, I almost want to pull that up quick just so people can see. Trying to find, my buddy posted it on his Instagram earlier. Where is it? I can't see it right now. Oh, yes, I can. So yeah, obviously rail workers in the US especially, I guess I shouldn't say especially, I don't know what the conditions of rail workers are globally. But their conditions in the US are horrible compared to the other industries. They're just so highly exploited. Their unions have been busted. The workers have no idea how to organize. And what's really killing the industry, or what's really killing worker cooperation and organization in rail, is the use of scabs, or the use of quote unquote private contractors. So the railways have their set employees who are unionized, but then they'll bring in these private contractors, basically just scabs or independent contractors, people who aren't actually employees of the company, so they don't have legal protections and they don't have the same wages, and they don't have the same collective bargaining power that the unions have. So it takes away from the collective bargaining power of the union, right? If the union goes on strike or threatens strike for higher wages, the railroads will say, oh, we'll just hire a bunch of scabs, we'll just hire a bunch of non-union independent contractors. And it prevents the union from really doing anything of substance, and creates division on the railroad. And that's been going on forever. So if you want to be really, really helpful in creating revolution in the US, go join the rail union, work on the tracks, and organize those workers, because they are in a vital section of the economy, and they need a lot of help in organizing and combining to fight those darn dirty rail capitalists. And also, like, I hate to hit on this for like the third stream in a row, but this is something that comes to mind. Like, a lot of the people, and I know this because I have buddies who are organizing in rail, a lot of the people on the railroad, a lot of those workers who are some of the most exploited workers in the country, on the continent, period, just working insane hours, extremely dangerous jobs for very, very little, because their organizing efforts have been busted up for years. And a lot of these people are like, they consider themselves Republicans or conservatives, or they voted for Trump, and then you have people online on Twitter mostly saying, or TikTok or whatever, saying we shouldn't organize anybody, if they don't have all the correct social positions, or if they don't, share my views about identity politics or in the culture war or whatever. And we need to, ban workers who have these specific positions from our organizations completely, because if they voted for Trump, they're a fascist. This ideology is I think an ideology created by the ruling class to divide workers. And if you think about it practically, I always bring up the John Deere strikes in the Midwest, where I went and stood, on the picket line with people who told me like, yeah, I voted for Trump, but I'll still organize in my own self-interest. I'll still organize for workers. I'll still, engage in class struggle against my boss. Same thing with these rail workers. Just they probably voted for Trump because they have no idea what their own political interests are. We live in the neoliberal capitalist empire, where we know our media and education system are controlled by the capitalist class, and they use that to control our minds. But then we look at the working masses around us, and if they're confused about politics, or if they didn't vote for the right person, or if they don't have all the correct issues, we're going to cancel them. But they're being lied to 100% of the time by the establishment. Of course, they're going to have backwards ideas. You know, what they need is a real organization, real education, and people who really want to make their lives better. You know, and then they can progress and educate themselves, you know, and if we achieve socialism, those people will hopefully have more time to, you know, travel, educate, experience other cultures, and, you know, their bigoted or reactionary ideas will be developed away or educated away. This has always been the view of socialism. You know, but we should still organize these people into unions, or if they're theoretically advanced section of the proletariat, you know, organize them into a party, because they're in the working class. And usually these political labels or these political ideas that they have, like, oh, I voted for Trump in 2016, or, you know, I voted for him in 2020, whatever else. There were a lot of people in the Midwest who voted for Obama in 2012 and Trump in 2016. Like, that doesn't make someone a fascist, right? That doesn't mean you should write somebody off. A lot of people are just confused. A lot of people thought Trump said he was going to bring the jobs back. He said he was going to end the wars. The other option was Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. You know, not everybody within this political circus, controlled by an oligarchy, who tried to vote their way out of the oligarchy with a demagogue like Trump, you know, not everybody who did that's a fascist. A lot of them were just confused. A lot of them thought Trump was actually going to fight for the workers, and he didn't. And that's not to say Trump didn't, you know, utilize bigotry towards immigrants, or, you know, any kind of hateful rhetoric to organize people. He certainly did. You know, but that bigotry towards immigrants and that hateful rhetoric has been injected into the working class by the ruling class for years, because they use it to divide people, right? They always say, oh, the reason your wages are dropping are because of immigrant labor, you know, because when the U.S. like destroys Haiti or destroys some country they're mad at, a bunch of people flee that country. And this always happens with colonialism. You always have people fleeing the colonized country for the colonizer country, because they're like, oh, you know, that country is bombing my country. It must be safe to go over there. Then they have the bombs, in a lot of cases. So, you know, immigrant labor, which in a lot of cases are, you know, refugees or people fleeing countries destroyed by imperialism, does drive wages down overall. So then the Republicans for years have just used that as a scapegoat for the workers. You know, we're not going to raise all of your wages universally. We're not going to raise your wages and the immigrants' wages and stop destroying people's countries and creating so many refugees. They don't say that. They just say, blame the immigrants, blame the immigrants. And then they run out the back door with all the money. So overcoming that division, I think, should be the main goal of socialists right now. And so we can actually achieve, you know, class organization. But yeah, another rant. Sorry. My parents immigrated here to the States, and my mom hates when I talk bad about the US. That's interesting. I mean, I've been making the distinction more too, because I always just say, oh, the US, the US, the US, the US. And of course I'm referring to the US capitalist class and the US government. But I worry that people have internalized, you know, just anti-US, like I'm the anti-US guy because I'm a tanky. It's like, no, I pretty much disagree with everything that the US government does because they're controlled by this capitalist oligarchy. But the antithesis of that, the opposite of that, is the working mass. You know, the American working mass are not the ones who do imperialism. You know, they are sent to fight and die a lot of times in these wars for capitalist expansion. And a lot of times they come back with PTSD and get no help from the government who sent them over there to fight. But it's not the workers or the masses who are driving imperialism. And it's not even the workers or masses benefiting from imperialism anymore. They're nickel and diming us with taxes and whatever else so they can continue 8 million wars and make a bunch of money for the weapons contractors. It's in all of our interests to overthrow imperialism, and that's why we have to separate imperialism from the masses. from the working masses, because it's in all of our interests to overthrow it. All of our material interests. We are dialectically completely opposed to the capitalist class as exploited workers. Hey, Eddie, can you please explain how socialist production works? How we produce stuff and distribute it? How will socialist industry work? I mean, that's a huge question. That is a huge question. Actually, sorry, I forgot to talk about the strike authorization, by the way. Strike authorization ballots are in the mail. Shout out to the rail workers. Go on strike. Fight those darn dirty capitalists. Beat them up. Woohoo! Sorry. The video I want to talk about, I am going to send you the construction of socialism in modern China. So this is going to explain how China's economic development and their construction of socialism has progressed since the revolution. What did their economy look like before the revolution? What happened to their economy after the revolution and during the period of Mao? What happened after Mao when Deng Xiaoping took over? And then a short summary of what has happened in the modern era. But this is basically, China is the most advanced country in the world in pretty much every way, but absolutely the most advanced country when it comes to Marxism, Marxist theory, and the construction of socialism. So China is the best and most advanced example of what socialist production will look like. And you can compare and contrast China to other countries who have had, or even China itself under Mao, had far less private investment and far less markets, far less capitalism, basically, and more of a centrally planned economy or top-down planned economy. Not really top-down, bottom-up, but either way. Either way, yeah, China's market reforms, though, were essential to their survival, right? Essential to them combating imperialism, essential to China becoming what they are today. So even though you could say technically the market reforms were less socialist, whatever that even means, they have aided in the construction of socialism over time. They've been instrumental in the construction of socialism over time. So even though China has a lot of, like billionaires and markets and private industry, I would still say they're by far the best example of a socialist economy. The masses in the U.S. are largely religious. How does Marxism justify itself in being any less predatory by speaking for the people and dismissing their religiosity as opiate intoxication? Marx's analysis of religion within capitalist society is much more complex than that. It's much deeper. He's actually never anti-religion. And this is sort of a myth about 20th century socialism. The main socialist thinkers and theorists were atheists or materialists. But they did not believe in, rooting religion out of society. People had their religious freedom. One thing that I like to bring up is the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, China, were exempt from China's one-child policy. They got a religious exemption. So we're supposed to believe that China is, forcibly genociding these people, and the U.S. needs to intervene. When China exempted the Uyghur Muslims for religious reasons from the one-child policy that the rest of the country was subjected to. So this religious repression is kind of a myth. And, Marx said that religion is the opium of the masses under capitalism, meaning it's how they find community. It's how they force themselves and submit their will, as Marx would say, to going to work every day and being exploited every day on an incredible level. Living in these terrible conditions despite the immense wealth, people often turn to religion. It's almost like a hit of opium at the end of the week. You get that community and you get that sense that I'm doing this, living this very, very, very hard life where I'm exploited for a higher power. And so that one day, I can go to the afterlife and it'll be a good afterlife. So I was good on earth and had the Protestant work ethic and believed in salvation or whatever. So, and religion served as an opium of the masses under feudalism too. It was just the Catholic Church that had most of the power in Europe. But, Marx says that religion, while also giving the workers a sense of community and being something that bonds them together, even within liberal, individualist, capitalist society, it still has its material basis in production, right? So religion is still produced. So if you look at how production changed over time, the way that religion is produced also changed. So you had the Catholic Church, had a lot of the land at the time of the French Revolution, and the revolutionaries targeted the church as well as the aristocracy. And the Catholic Church in general was saying that these feudal lords, these kings, these people who control the peasants in the land, they were ordained by God. They have the divine right of kings. So in that way, religion was used to enforce the mode of production, get people, get the masses to accept this feudal mode of production where they had to, be beholden or basically enslaved by the king or by the lord. Once capitalism starts to come about in Europe and feudalism falls apart, you see the Protestant Revolution. You see Lutheranism come about and later Calvinism with these ideas of the Protestant work ethic. And there's more of an emphasis on faith, blind faith, which, capitalism and the invisible hand of the market is basically a dogma, the way that libertarians adhere to the invisible hand of the market and pretend it's, always going to lead to the best results is basically a form of faith, and this goes along with the Protestant idea of just have faith in the market, have faith in capitalism. These economic crises, this anarchic system of production that we can't control at all is just going to work itself out in the end, and it's going to be best for everyone. Just got to trust the invisible hand. Fits very well with Protestantism, Calvinism especially. And then now I want to do a more materialist analysis of religion in the US and how it's developed in the US. But for sure, I think the number one form of capitalist religion in the modern era is prosperity gospel. This idea that the more faith you have, the more you believe in God, the more God will reward you with wealth. And this is an idea being preached by a lot of these giant mega churches, like basically church conglomerates, which are called mega churches, who preach this prosperity gospel, and it's literally like the more you give to us, the more you give to the church, the more money God will give you. And it's the full commodification of religion and of the people's spirituality, which Marx is against, right? Under socialism, the people can have their spirituality. They can have their religion. They can actually be in community with each other. Under capitalism is when religion becomes commodified and when it becomes an opium, or under the feudal relations of production, which are also, dominating exploitative relations of production. That's when religion becomes an opium for people, as well as a tool to beat them over the head and maintain the mode of production. But if you look at Nicaragua, to give an even better example of religion under socialism, there were 3 different factions in the Sandinistas who could have taken power. And the Sandinistas took power in Nicaragua via a guerrilla struggle in the 70s or 80s. Was it the 80s? I think it was the 80s. And then were ousted from power largely because of the U.S. empire and IMF and World Bank infiltration, propaganda, blah, blah, blah. But then 6 years later, the Sandinistas came back into power. And this time, rather than a guerrilla struggle, they did it via elections. And the faction of the Sandinistas that won out was the more Catholic faction. The faction of the Sandinistas who wanted to embrace religion and use the people's religion as a means to organize them. Because, as Marx said, religion isn't just evil. It isn't just something that needs to be eradicated and rooted out from society. It brings the workers into community with each other, the masses into community with each other, and it gives them shared values to struggle for. Nicaragua has a very, very Catholic or very religious form of socialism compared to really anywhere else in the world. And it's very interesting. And that's why I'm pretty clear that Marxism is not anti-religion. I'm not anti-religion. I've talked about this before. My family is extremely religious. They're evangelicals. I gave my brother a book about liberation theology. Gave my sister one too for Christmas last year. And, you know, they're basically socialists. I don't know if they'd call themselves socialists or communists. My sister probably would, but they definitely lean that direction or would organize that direction, or they are organizing for that. So, yeah, religious people can be communists. End of story. All right, I went on such a rant. Prosperity gospel is antithetical to Christ's teaching, for sure, for sure. Damn, Eddie, you gave me a brain explosion. Woo! I'm happy. Thank you, Cobra Commander. I'm glad I could do that for you. Brain explosion in America is basically the faith of the free market, holy church of capital. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And if you listen to libertarians talk too, it's very clear it's basically a dogma. You know, there's no scientific analysis with modern capitalist economists. And the what is it called? The economic calculation problem, the ECP. With modern libertarians, if you actually talk to them and actually engage with them, which you should, you should learn why they're wrong. The ECP, the economic calculation problem, is another dogma. It's something that Mises came up with in like the 1910s or 1920s. And it's been expanded since then by Friedrich Hayek and other pseudo-intellectuals. But the idea is that economic calculation or a planned economy is entirely impossible. You could never, ever, ever, ever do it and have it be as efficient as capitalism, which, what kind of thesis is that? Like, who says this is impossible? This kind of economic system is impossible. We can never, ever do it, no matter how much humans develop and technology advances and how hard we try. Like, when has that ever been true? Humans can do just about anything they set their mind to if they cooperate and put their labor towards it. Of course, we could create socialism out of capitalism, despite, problems or difficulties with the calculation. And this has been proved. Read Paul Cockshot's Towards a New Socialism. The Republic of Walmart is another good book that debunks the ECP. Like, it'd be very, very easy to do a planned economy and have it be very efficient. As well as Mises and Hayek were just looking at, a top-down planned economy, not modern socialism where there are markets, or private investment, at least right now. So it's just ridiculous, and it's a dogma, though. Because they say socialism's impossible, they never have to argue with socialists even. If a socialist starts to beat them in an argument, they'll just be like, ECP, 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 economic calculation problem. And they can never even explain what it means. Even like the ones who consider themselves smart, like the libertarians who are supposedly their leaders, at least on TikTok, right? I guess my standard is probably low because of TikTok. They can't even explain what the ECP is. I'm like, I read all about the ECP for some libertarian debate that I did. I'm like, I understand the ECP better now than any libertarian because I read like one book on it. No one would accuse a neoliberal of being dialectical. True. Liberals don't know basic economics. So true. So true. That's what made me become a Marxist, was taking liberal economics and be like, these people can't explain anything. Like, this is like being in church and, hearing about the Bible and religion. And I'm just supposed to, believe it, not based on evidence, but just believe it because someone in power is telling me. That was my economics professor, who, by the way, runs for office every year as part of the GOP. And she's the head of the local GOP. But she told me, like, socialism fails every time because Venezuela, literally. She's like, Venezuela was doing really good. They were one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Then they did socialism. Now they're in poverty. And I just asked her, like, I didn't even know that much about Venezuela at this point. I was like, what about the sanctions? What about the economic sanctions that the U.S. puts on Venezuela? What effect does that have? She's like, well, there's some effect, but mostly it's socialism. I was like, why? Like, what effect does socialism have in relation to the sanctions? And, I'm like, the sanctions have to have some effect. She's like, I'm sure they do. But, socialism is the real reason they failed, and if they didn't do socialism, we wouldn't have to put sanctions on them. Like, just this ridiculous shit. We have to sanction you. for trying to create an independent economic system. We had to do it, but seeing that they couldn't explain anything, and seeing that modern economics was basically a dogma or like a religion, I was pissed. I was like, what the hell? I thought I was going to learn a lot. And I did learn stuff from that economics class because that's when I started reading Marx simultaneously. But yeah, it was super frustrating. I remember literally thinking at one point, we can never understand the world at all. We can never understand history at all because too much just happened. There was too much that went down in history to know everything. You're just learning facts in a vacuum, basically, until you have dialectical materialism and historical narratives of class struggle, or the lens of analysis of class struggle. And then, economics, when I was taking that economics class, I'm like, economics is such a big part of the world, how we produce things, how we distribute things. The ruling economic class is clearly the ruling political class, but we can never understand economics, right? It's just too complicated. Supply and demand is the best we can get. And this is just ridiculous. Then I read Marx. I'm like, oh, finally somebody's making a material analysis of the economy and then just tracing it to see how it affects politics. Someone's finally making a materialist analysis of like how the world works, and it finally makes sense. And until you learn Marxism, because Marxism is ripped and rooted out of academia, and Marxist narratives are in Western academia. Until you learn Marx, you're basically just learning historical facts or economic facts in a vacuum, right? You can list off like a million facts, but you might have no lens of analysis, no understanding of how history progresses, no understanding of how production affects the superstructure, and vice versa. So once you learn Marx, you kind of can see this historical narrative, and you see, certain classes as struggling against each other and as agents of history. It makes history way more interesting to read. Reading about Bolivar and the Bolivarian Revolution in Latin America last year was really interesting because I liked looking at all the different class dynamics. Right? There's this class of like ranchers who were here. This class, Bolivar was from the Creole class, which was like people native to Latin America, but who were capitalists and who were merchants. And they were the real leaders of the revolution against the royalists, against the feudal colonizers. And you see all these different classes going at each other, and you see how class struggle truly is what moves history and truly is what leads to new systems and new political systems. But if I didn't have Marxism and dialectical materialism, I would have just been reading facts about Bolivar. Right now, I would have been like, that's interesting. I now know about the Bolivarian Revolution, but it becomes so much more interesting once you see it through the lens of class struggle. Same with studying the American Civil War. My favorite thing about American history is learning about the generals in the Union who had a positive view of Marx and wanted a stronger working class material conditions. So many. There were so many. Radical Republicans at the time were basically socialists. Right? They were saying we want a republic, and then we want to protect the economic well-being of everyone in the republic by giving them land and by giving them tools to work their own land and create their own means of subsistence. There were people in America who maybe didn't even call themselves Marxists or who didn't see themselves as Marxists, who were basically utopian socialists, or pre-Marx Marxists or pre-Marx socialists. They saw what was going to come about with private property and with unfettered capitalism, because American slavery existed alongside capitalism in the North and capitalism in Europe. And slavery just basically provided this massive cotton market, which helped with the enrichment and capitalist expansion and accumulation happening in the North and happening in Europe. So, they had watched capitalism develop for a while. They had seen what the proletariat in Europe was living like, the exploited conditions that they were living under. The class of free laborers, of wage laborers in the American South was living in terrible conditions because, even though the slaves were living under the worst form of like torture and exploitation imaginable, the employers or the slave owners at least had to take care of the slaves because that was technically their property, so you don't want to push your slaves so hard that they die or accidentally kill them, because then, you're losing some kind of value. But the wage laborers were selling their labor in competition with slave labor, which drove, the wages way, 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 way down. And the capitalists or slave owners didn't have this incentive to make sure they were at least surviving. So you had that class, once the Civil War broke out, of course, sided with the Union and were ready to overthrow the plantation oligarchy, who they hated. So, people were seeing already what wage labor was going to be and what capitalism and capital accumulation was going to be. And they were saying, let's not do that. Let's put fetters on capitalism to make sure it doesn't accumulate and become, a horrible imperialist dictatorship. But those people did not win. Reconstruction pretty much failed for the working masses. And we got the Gilded Age and an oligarchy. Is Zamora in Honduras still good? Good question. It's better than having a right winger. It's hard to keep up with everything, but it's better than having a freaking borderline fascist, which is what Honduras and Colombia usually have. U.S. built its economy on slaves. Yes, I wrote an article about that. Are you a Marxist-Leninist? Yes, sir. How much do you know about left communism and whatnot? A decent amount. I've read Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder like 3 times. It's one of my favorite books. I also like Combat Liberalism by Mao. But most of what I know about left communism, honest and ultras, and left communism as an infantile disorder, most of what I know about that comes from my experience, right? Because I've been on TikTok for so long, and I wasn't always as staunch or as principled of a Marxist-Leninist as I am now. I was just like, I'm a Marxist, and I'm going to learn more as I go. And I quickly saw that left communism or ultras are not what I want to be. I basically find them to be indistinguishable from liberals. And then Marxism-Leninism, I just think is the most correct. The ideology that's been the most right historically, that reforms itself, that is the most pragmatic, that is the most interested in actually bringing about socialism and liberation. That is anti-imperialist and explains why imperialism happens, which we're going to get to at some point today, I promise. But yeah. Left communism is when you call USSR red fascist. Yes. Yes, it is. What do you think about Marxism, Leninism, Maoism? I think in the modern era, it's basically been co-opted by the ruling class. I think, I don't want to accuse people of being controlled opposition all the time, because I can really tear a movement apart, even though there is controlled opposition, obviously. But if I had to guess, if anybody was controlled opposition, well, I shouldn't say that. I think a lot of the rad libs would be, or at least are having their content boosted by bots or whatever, in various cases. But I would say that a lot of like the MLMs, like the Jason Unruhe and people like that, who are just extreme ultras, who claim to be Maoists but hate every existing form of socialism. I think they might be CIA backed or State Department astroturfed at least, because that's just, taking the name of Mao and using it to be a complete ultra, which I read Mao's quotes this year, and in the notes I put so many times like Mao would not be a Maoist today. Mao was pragmatic. Mao was a dialectical materialist. Mao was concerned with what will actually bring about his people's well-being, maintain their sovereignty, and bring about the construction of socialism. He wasn't worried about just being, the most socialistic country, or, he wasn't focused on just continuing with the Cultural Revolution forever and that being key. The Cultural Revolution that Mao carried out was at a time when China was transitioning from like feudalism and slavery, trying to transition into socialism and industrialize. And they hadn't been brought capitalist development by capitalism. They had to do it themselves and industrialize themselves. So the Cultural Revolution, although there were many mistakes that were made, and China now calls it a huge regret or a huge mistake, it did a lot to move their culture away from feudalism and towards socialism. And now you have Marxist, Leninist, Maoists today, like, we need to wage a people's war on the government right now, like take up arms right now, as if that wouldn't just get everyone killed. or they're saying we need to have a cultural revolution, and we need to have a cultural revolution right now. It's like, no, we need to meet people's material needs. We need to make sure people stop dying because they don't have access to healthcare. We need to make sure that medical bankruptcies aren't the most common way to lose all your money in the country. As more and more, it's 60% of Americans at this point have medical debt. That's how exploitative and perverse our healthcare system is. We need to focus on these material things, not the things that Marxist Leninist Maoists are always focusing on. And then, you have like the Shining Path in Peru. I don't know if they were backed by the CIA, but, if they weren't, which a lot of people think they were, and if they weren't, they were still doing the work of the CIA, right? Basically acting as actual authoritarian dictators, similar to Pol Pot, who was CIA, targeting peasants and killing peasants who disagreed with them, committing massacres and atrocities against the people. Anti-Marxist stuff, but all in the name of waging this protracted people's war, and fighting revisionism by killing revisionists, even if they're peasant working people. Just absurd ultra stuff. So Sebastian Leon, who is a writer on staff at Midwestern Marx, told us that the Shining Path are basically considered to be terrorists in Peru. And he's a Marxist-Leninist communist, and he doesn't support the Marxist-Leninist Maoist insurgency that did they take power, or at least almost took power in his own country, because they threw the country into a brutal civil war and did not help the masses. Whoa, go over Pol Pot one day, the CIA angle. Okay, let me pull up something for y'all. This is a book review on Pol Pot, so you don't have to read the whole book, which is really nice. Sometimes monthly review or Midwestern Marx will do book reviews and kind of summarize the main points of the book and criticize anything that needs to be criticized. So some of these books, we don't have time to read everything. So it's nice to get the main ideas summarized in an article. And this is one of those book summaries that I would say everybody should read. Another one is this book summary by Monthly Review of the Korean War by Hugh Dean. That book summary will help you understand Korea and the Korean War. This book summary will help you understand Pol Pot and Cambodia. Various things in this that are important. By example, I have this article like memorized from when people ask me about Cambodia and Pol Pot. The Pol Pot leadership, made up of former students who had been educated in France, as well as anti-colonial elements, based themselves on the class of the poorest peasants. And this was reflected in the ideology of the leadership. So very sketchy that they were trained in France. Obviously, we know the Western universities often produce Western dictators or Western puppet leaders, like Syngam Rhee in South Korea, or occupied Korea that we were just talking about. But the review says, here is Pol Pot talking about his Marxism. The big, thick words of Marx, I didn't really understand them at all, says one of the founders of Pol Pot's Communist Party. That was Pol Pot himself. One of the founders of Pol Pot's Communist Party said Marx was too deep for us. In fact, although influenced by their own versions of Marxism, only 2 Cambodians ever attended the French Communist Party school for cadres. So only 2 of them were really trained in theory and in organizing and the construction of socialism. For Pol Pot and his cronies, Marxism signified an ideal, not a comprehensive system of thought to be mastered and applied. So they basically took Marxism, and this is my main critique of MLMs. They take Marxism and they make it an ideal, right? Marxism isn't the science of class struggle, right? Marxism isn't the science and the study of the laws of historical development, societal development. Marxism's just this ideal. Marxism is when the workers take power and then we all just start sharing the next day and we all live in one big tent communally. That's what Marxism is. And if the peasants and the workers don't agree to live in our big tent communally, then we'll kill them. That's basically the idealist, CIA-backed Marxist-Leninist Maoist ideology as it exists today. And again, I think Mao would be totally against it. And I think Pol Pot was a good example. Even though China backed Pol Pot, by the way, one of their biggest L's in history, whereas Vietnam took out that CIA-funded goof. Dang it, we're getting another prawn website. I think Ho Chi Minh was taught partially in France. He was. You are correct. And he was actually influenced by the French because he thought, similar to Che Guevara when he was young, he thought the imperialists were evil. You know, he thought the French were evil for the colonial tactics and the forms of exploitation that they carried out against Vietnam. But then he went to France and he said, they're not evil. You know, the working people, the working masses are good people. They're exploited just like the people of Vietnam. You know, it's in our interest to struggle together against this government. And he was heavily influenced by a lot of stuff in France and a lot of stuff in the West, to the point where after or when Vietnam was fighting their anti-colonial struggle against France, trying to kick out the French colonizers, Ho Chi Minh quoted the Declaration of Independence to the U.S. and said that the U.S. should come to our support. You know, the U.S. claims to be a country that supports freedom above all else. And here's Vietnam waging this anti-colonial struggle against the French colonizers. You know, the U.S. should come to their aid if they care about freedom. But instead of doing that, the U.S. invaded Vietnam right after the French were kicked out and tried to take that colony from the French, dropping tons and tons of Agent Orange and napalm on Vietnam, destroying their infrastructure and agriculture, and turning what would have been a really easy, comparatively to other transitions to socialism, what would have been a really easy transition to socialism in Vietnam, into an extremely difficult transition to socialism because all of their infrastructure and their productive forces were destroyed by U.S. bombs. So Ho Chi Minh was influenced by the West, and he always held solidarity and love for the American masses. But the Western imperialists attacked him and tried to kill him at every turn, even when he appealed to their sensibilities, their supposed sensibilities. Ho also studied in the USSR, for sure. Faux show. Eddie reacted to a TikTok, for sure. I can watch that in a sec. I got to go to the bathroom here. So what should I pull up? What do y'all want to watch while I'm gone? Wrestling video? What do the people like for intermissions? Do you prefer music? Well, we got to be careful with music because of copyright, but we can find some more communist music for the next time. Or do you like the wrestling videos? That's not me. Here, I'll watch some from my junior season. Where are we at? Where's me kicking someone's butt? I'm trying to find an exciting match. Oh, here's a guy I got in a fight with. Yeah, this is like the only match I ever got in a fight with a guy. All right, enjoy. I'll be back after I pee. I have returned. How am I doing? Should I skip to the part where I about fight this guy? So I was beating him by like 13 at one point. I'm beating him by like 12 or 13. I go to get on top because sometimes you restart with the guy on bottom and you get on top and then they blow the whistle and you go. And as I'm getting on top, this kid turns around, down by 12, like this. He's like, I'll beat your ass. And I was like, buddy, you're losing by 12. Like, your ass has already been beat. You know, this was when the match was already over. So that just made me angry. For context, and I actually like this team. Their coach is a nice guy. But this guy brought out the worst in me. Maybe this is where he says it. It was after I just took him down. Yeah, he just shoved me there. So I guess he didn't say it yet, but he did shove me. Crushing this boy. And then this guy later at a bar tried to hit on my girlfriend at the time. Tried to hit her up. So he just took a whole lot of L's. Here, yeah, there he just said it. He just said, I'm going to beat your ass. I'm like, boy, you're down by 12. Now I start jumping around. Now I'm just mad at this guy. So he shoved me in the face. So they gave me a point there. They gave me a point because he punched me like 3 times. So that was the most cocky thing I've ever done in the sport of wrestling. I put my arms up and I said, what are you going to do, buddy? What are you going to do? And now I grabbed him and I was literally whispering in his ear, you going to beat my ass? Like, how are you going to beat my ass when you're down by 12? You suck. Like, what are you going to do? And then they took a point from me because the ref heard me talking. And then they took a point from my team. The ref just looked back as one of my teammates like, oh, what the fuck? I said the F word. Then they took a point from us for saying the F word. Crazy times. So, yeah, there you go. Wrestling be crazy. That sport is gi. Yeah, for sure. That's the only reason I do it. Super awesome. Thank you. Sounds like his ego is acting up a bit. Yeah, that tends to happen in wrestling. Got a lot of strong personalities clashing heads. All right, let's break down some theory. Going back to what I was talking about an hour and 15 minutes ago when I started this stream, I want to talk about more basic theory. Yeah, Jacob, I will react to that. If not now, later. I'm adding it to the list of videos to look at here. But something I want to do after talking to my parents and realizing, you know, even though they have a son who talks about communism on the internet, they didn't understand communism very well as I thought they did. Even though we've had, you know, countless conversations about it. Okay, Jacob, I got your video saved, so we should be good there now. I was shocked by how little they knew, just like the basics, you know, and I realized it's been so long since I started going over like the basics of Marxism, you know, or started talking about like wage, labor, and capital. A while back, I did a video, like a sketch, a little skit with my buddies explaining wage, labor, and capital. You know, one of the guys makes the shoe, and then the capitalist takes the shoe and sells it for $7, gives the worker $1, takes $2 for himself, and uses the rest for accumulation and for expanding his empire. Just like little stuff like that, because that stuff is really, really helpful. Because the masses are starved for political, economic, and philosophical education. Because as we were talking about earlier, we just learned facts in a vacuum in the U.S. There's no purpose to the facts, no narrative to history, and no collective future that we're striving towards. And the American dream is really, just this individualist future that we're told to fight for against our fellow worker. But anyways, Americans are starved for that political education. They want to struggle. They want to struggle against their government. They know their government's an oligarchy that's screwing them. They want to cooperate and organize. They just need a path to do it, right? They need someone bringing them that education. They need a party that they can actually get behind. They need people in their workplace helping them organize and get into a union. And strengthen that union and work within that union. This is what people need, and this is what they've been starved of. So, I like talking about high-level theoretical Marx stuff, and I like talking about those things with Carlos. I'm reading Hegel right now, so most of the stuff I talk about kind of sounds like gobbledygook to people who aren't initiated with Marx. But if I abandon the basics and if I stop teaching the basics of Marxism, I'm basically just learning it for myself at that point, which is good. You should always learn for yourself and expand your own knowledge and engage with what you want to engage with and what you think you need to engage with to overcome your blind spots and expand your own theoretical knowledge. But as a content creator, I need to be putting out stuff that goes over the basics. Like, honestly, that should be like 75% of what I'm producing. It's stuff that goes over the basic theory of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism for workers so that they can use it and understand it and start to build up their theoretical knowledge, build a basis. So that's what I want to do. I took two chapters of Lenin's Imperialism. The chapter on export capital, which we'll go over second, and the chapter on imperialism as a stage of capitalism, as a stage in the never-ending development of capitalism. Well, hopefully ending eventually, but thus far. Because I think these are very relevant for modern day. I think these are relevant concepts to understand for making geopolitical analysis, understanding the world, world politics, and global economics. But also it's good for understanding dialectics. It's good for understanding Marx's theory and how Lenin applied Marx's theory to Russia in his time and the world in his time. So, yeah, I mean, Lenin's Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, for those who don't know, is my favorite book ever written. The reason being, I went to college for politics, political science. I studied classes like U.S. foreign policy or global politics, international relations, stuff like that, as well as I got a minor in business, which just allowed me to take a bunch of economics classes. But after I got out of college, as I was going into my senior year, actually, I was still a social democrat, right? I was just like, these capitalists, these corporations who control the government, are so evil and so exploitative and so imperialistic. We just need to get rid of them. How do we do that? We have to elect better government officials. Even though 93% of elections are decided by the candidate who raises the most money, and even though our bills are written by lobbyists, I thought if we just vote for enough AOCs, then eventually we won't have imperialism and we won't be doing all these endless wars anymore. So I just thought the U.S. was like evil. Like, how can they be this evil? And then, clearly you see that the government is controlled by corporations, but still it's like, what do we do about this? And then in my senior year, or maybe after I graduated, I don't remember exactly when it was, but after I had finished most of my politics undergrad, I read Lenin's Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism. This book that's, how many pages long is it? 128 pages long. And this 128-page book explained everything, or 98% of the questions I had after majoring in politics, right? After looking at geopolitics, looking at the way in which world governments act, reading this book from Lenin that he wrote in Russia in 1917, explained more about the world and more about geopolitics and global economics than anything I had read while getting a bachelor's degree in politics, which means I read a lot of really great books about the world, about geopolitics. This one was still best because it just explained what was so obvious to me. What had been so obvious, but what I was, scared to put words to or scared to put analysis to, because you're taught, Marx is evil. Don't use any Marxist analysis when you're in Western academia. But Lenin was just like, yeah, capitalism turns into its monopoly stage. Monopoly capitalists and finance capitalists then control the government, create a financial oligarchy, and they do imperialism. They try and expand to control markets, labor, and resources, as well as political systems abroad. And just hearing it explained that simply, I was like, oh, it was such a light bulb in my head. It was like I just got bingo. I was like, now I get it. Marx was right. So after studying, I like to say that after studying geopolitics for 4 years at an academic level, fairly high undergraduate level, this book from Lenin from 1917 that he wrote for the peasants and for the workers still explains imperialism better than anything. But yeah, that's why this is my favorite book. Someone says, what happened to your TikTok? I have a new one, MidwesternMarx.com. Eddie Liger-Smith is resting in peace. But let's talk about why this book, or let's summarize the chapter on imperialism as a stage of capitalism and talk about why I think that's such an important chapter and why it shows, highlights some of the principles of Marxist theory and provides an example of how to apply Marxist theory to modern day, to capitalism as it's developed since Marx's death. So dialectics, the principle of dialectics and dialectical materialism, which is the philosophy of Marx and Lenin, the philosophy of class struggle, that's what it's been called. One of the principles of dialectics is constant change, constant development. Nothing is ever stagnant, right? Nothing is ever not subject to change. Everything in the world, all of matter is in motion. And therefore, all of matter is constantly changing. And generally, quantitative changes, change in numbers, can lead to a qualitative change, a change in form. So don't worry if you don't understand what that means. We'll go in depth a little more later. But basically, what dialectical materialism looks at is production and how production changes. How do humans produce our means of subsistence? How do we produce the things we need to survive and distribute those goods to the masses, to people in society? So for Marx, he actually uses this religious example of Adam taking the apple off the tree and taking a bite of it as the first productive act. So for Marx, taking the apple off the tree and eating it is an act of production. Adam is producing his means of subsistence, the things he needs to survive. In taking that apple off the tree and eating it, he has produced and consumed food, his means of subsistence. So Marxism looks at production, how humans produce things and how they organize production, and how that leads to changes in politics or changes in culture or changes in media, changes in things like that, which then reinforce changes in production. So like we were talking about earlier with religion, religion has its material basis in production. Right, churches get money from their congregations, and they produce religion. Right, they produce sermons, they produce religious music, and sometimes this religion is used to enforce the existing mode of production. Right, go and vote for the Republican Party every year because they're pro-life. Socialism is evil because God would have hated it. These are the kind of things I heard in church growing up. Religion has its material basis in production. But religion counts as the superstructure, which then influences production, right? So Protestant religion came about or was popularized at the same time, or Lutheranism and Calvinism, Protestantism was popularized at the same time capitalism was coming about. So changes in production, the change from feudalism to capitalism, changes in the relations of production, how humans produce, led to changes in the religion. Changes in how religion and religious ideology is produced. Religious ideology, for lack of a better word, I guess. Just how religion is produced. And then that religion which was changed with the change in production, is used to reinforce the new mode of production, right? So you have the Catholic Church under the era of feudalism saying that these kings, these lords, these landowners are ordained by God, as are we, the church, who owned a third of the land in France before the French Revolution. Under feudalism, they're saying that the lords are ordained by God, enforcing the feudal mode of production with the superstructure. Then when capitalism comes about, the Lutheran and Calvinist church start talking about enforcing the capitalist mode of production, right? Talking about the Protestant work ethic and how you just need to, go to work and work hard every day and not complain. And then if you do that, eventually you'll go to heaven. That's a great thing to tell people if you want to exploit them, right? If you want them to go to work every day so you can exploit them. Don't worry about your material conditions now. Don't organize for better conditions here on earth. You're going to go to heaven eventually. So the superstructure changes, the religion changes to enforce the new mode of production, even though the production of religion and the religion itself changed because of a change in production itself, how humans organize and organize the production of the means of subsistence. Catching another stream. Thank you all for the mid-Marx content creators and comrades. Thank you so much, Khrachvik. Thank you for your financial support there, and thank you for supporting the project in general. We're very proud of what we do. We're very proud because we have, so many great people like y'all who watch us and are learning with us and organizing with us. So much love. So I was reading the chat to see if there's anyone I need to ban. Cobra Commander, I'm going to make you a mod before we move any further. Right, Cobra Commander's on YouTube. Okay, I need a Twitch mod too. Just in case you want to give anyone the boot. I'll continue with Lenin here in a sec. Actually, Petamilo, you want to be a mod? Yes, that's a great idea. You're in here all the time. Add moderator. All right, there you go. I trust you, comrade. Don't abuse it. Don't ban any good comrades. And put people in a timeout first. If they're saying something that's not totally heinous, or just being out of control, evil, just put them in a timeout. And if they come back, then you can ban them. I try not to ban people the first time. And I try not to ban people for disagreeing, even if they're like a libertarian or something. It's nice to have different viewpoints in the comments. Only ban them if they're spamming or being hateful. You know how it goes. And who do I want to make a mod here in the Twitch chat? Jacob, are you still in here? Oh, you're not a mod, Jacob? What the hell? Sorry, man. All right, now you are. Jacob's here for like every stream. I can't believe I didn't make him a mod yet. Okay. Moving on. Where am I? So Lenin sees a new stage of capitalism develop, and this happens after Marx dies. So Marx is living around the time of the Industrial Revolution. It's industrializing, Europe is becoming industrialized. It's changing how humans produce, which is leading to changes in basically every form of, in every area of European society. The Industrial Revolution changes and revolutionizes everything, and you're really easily able to see how production and changes in production, how humans produce, the relations of production, lead to changes in the political system and changes in the rest of society. It becomes very obvious during the Industrial Revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, though, capitalism moves into a different stage. It develops into its monopoly stage. So as we said, dialectics say that everything is constantly changing. Everything is constantly in a state of development and constant flux. So capitalism is no different, right? People say, oh, what does Marx have to teach us? He wrote in the 1800s. Well, he can tell us about capitalism in the 1800s and leading up to it, right? Or the 1900s. No, 1800s, 19th century is what I was thinking. But anyways, he gave a Marxist analysis of his time and place. Then Lenin extends that analysis to his time and place. And it's the duty of Marxists today to extend that analysis to our time and place. So this is part of the reason I think it's really interesting to study this text, is because we get to see how Lenin applies Marxism to his own time. And he says capitalism is no longer in this state of free competition like it was under Marx, where you had smaller producers, smaller capitalists and manufacturers, yes, concentrating capital and accumulating capital and leading towards their monopoly stage. And Marx basically predicted that capital would monopolize. But Marx doesn't see the domination of finance capital, meaning the banks, and the full monopolization and control of capitalism in the home countries. Lenin does see this, and he sees that he says there's a dialectical change in capitalism from a system of free competition into its total opposite, a system with no competition, with monopoly domination, the domination of finance capital. So one of the principles of dialectics is that things are in constant change, yes, and things also become their opposite. So things are made up of a unity of opposites, and with development, something that is one thing at one time can become its opposite at another time. So capitalism goes from this system based on free competition. The best thing about capitalism is the free competition, the market competition. You still have capitalists say this today. And Lenin is saying, no, after capital accumulates and concentrates at the top, capitalism is no longer in a state of free competition. Not any producer, can enter the market and bring their commodities to market and trade. It's these giant monopolies, these giant corporations, which develop into multinational corporations, which dominate with the help and after merging with the banks. So the banks allow for much more fluidity of capital, and also allows for capitalists to take out huge loans and expand their capital. It just gives capital much more control. So once these banks merge with the industrial capitalists and with the big manufacturing capitalists of the day, that's when Lenin says capitalism is entering its monopoly stage. So the combination of industrial capital, so if I own like a manufacturing plant or something, that's industrial capital. The combination of that with banking capital is finance capital. So, the banks, there are, people on the boards of banks who are also shareholders of, giant companies. And at this point, you have giant investment hedge funds, which are controlled by banks and bankers and various shareholders who have their arms in other banks. So capital and finance capital has accumulated very high at the top. But, you no longer have capitalist A controls business A, and he's in competition with capitalist B who controls business B. You have an oligarchy of shareholders who control various banks or who control industrial capital. And they are the drivers of imperialism, and they are the ruling class in this monopoly stage of capitalism after it progresses to that stage. So Lenin says that the capital of a dozen or so banks controls thousands upon or even millions of smaller banks. And this is after he discusses the creation of finance capital. And today, finance capital has completed its control of the world, right? It's finance capital has control, and a few banks have control of all the other banks on a fully global level. And really on an insane level, the level that finance capitalists and the financial oligarchy has been able to control the world is crazy. So Lenin is talking about how capitalism developed into its monopoly stage. But after Lenin's death, with World War II, you have a bunch of damage to the infrastructure in Europe as well as the Soviet Union, basically allowing the US to emerge as the dominant imperialist capitalist country. And they create the IMF. And they create the World Bank in 1949, I believe. And these are two global financial institutions, basically two global central banks. And the IMF and the World Bank are able to give orders to all of these smaller financial institutions, all these arms of financial imperialism, which are set up all over the world. The whole global financial order takes orders from the IMF and the World Bank. And, for one of the early examples of how the IMF and the World Bank were used to strangle a country, Salvador Allende in Chile, prior to him taking power democratically in an election, Chile was receiving $200 million a year, I believe, in funding from the IMF and World Bank and IMF financing for developmental loans and whatever else. After Allende took power democratically, the IMF and the World Bank brought that down to 2 million, from 200 to 2. And this is after Richard Nixon said, make the economy scream. So the IMF and World Bank have so much power. They basically act as financial dictators on the global stage. And you have the creation of all these different financial agreements and different international banks, all of which are controlled by the West or the US or the same oligarchs, the same, handful of bankers who control the IMF and World Bank. And as Lenin says, you just have a handful of these bankers controlling millions of smaller banks. And as Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets points out very well and very succinctly, there's been way more banks created that are literally just arms of US imperialism or arms of the IMF and the World Bank. So you have like the Asian Development Bank in Asia, and you'd think that, a bank controlled by Asian countries, a bank controlled by China or something? No, it's a bank controlled by the US. And they have these in Latin America, and they have these in Africa, and they have these in Southern Asia. They have these, development banks, which are sometimes even named after the place where they're in, but they're controlled by the US, and they're controlled by the IMF and World Bank. So exactly what Lenin's talking about here, where you have some central, very powerful banks who control a bunch of other smaller financial institutions and banks. Exactly what Lenin is talking about, just on a different stage, a different level, a more developed stage that we have to analyze in modern times. So this is what I'm getting at here with, Marx analyzed capitalism during the Industrial Revolution in the era of free competition and commodity circulation. Lenin analyzed capitalism as it developed into its imperialist stage. Vijay Prashad and us, the Marxists of today, have to analyze capitalism as it's progressed since then, and as it's progressed in our specific countries. So Lenin says in summary, in a very, very short but slightly insufficient summary, imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage. It is capitalism developed to the point where monopolies have most of the financial control. So colonial possessions of territories where capitalism hadn't developed. So in the colonies owned by the Western countries or controlled by the Western countries, where capitalism hadn't yet developed, we see a new form of financial colonialism come about, right? So a lot of countries at this time are gaining flag independence, as they call it. They're no longer directly colonized, politically controlled by dominant Western countries. So instead, sorry, am I lagging here? It says that my Wi-Fi connection is weak, which doesn't make any sense because I'm plugged in. But either way, the places where capitalism hadn't fully developed yet, and where they were struggling for their political independence, this new financial oligarchy, the finance capital, begins controlling territory financially. So rather than this direct form of colonialism, you have a more covert form of neocolonialism, where the financiers, the banks and the industrial capitalists, are still fully in control of the economy, still fully in control of foreign territory. They just don't directly control the politics, right? It's not like the French colony of Upper Volta. Upper Volta ended up becoming Burkina Faso and later became socialist. But these places were gaining flag independence. You're no longer just going to hold us as a direct colony. But this does not bring an end to colonialism, because capitalism in its new stage just finds a new way to colonize these countries, and they do it with finance capital. So that's another sort of dialectical change that you see there as capitalism develops into this new stage. So this happens after capitalism has fully taken hold of the world's territory and divided it among capitalists. So, capitalists will just continually expand into new lands, control new lands, new colonies until there's no more colonies to fight over. And once you have once there's no more colonies to just take, and once you have complete territorial division of the world, they begin fighting each other for the colonies, right? There's nowhere else to go unless we go mine the moon or something. There's no other land masses to control, so we're going to start fighting each other over these land masses. And that's something that happens within capitalism's monopoly stage. Dang it, I got another spam porn account. Block. Get out of here. Liberate sex workers. End the sex trade. Okay. This happens after capitalism is fully taken hold. So capitalism obviously developed in Europe first. So, there are a lot of racist ideas about why white people or European people had the most wealth or accumulated the most wealth or have throughout history. There's, a lot of people who try and use this idea of scientific racism, like, oh, the white men are just so much smarter, so they made more money. But it was just capitalism developed first in Europe. It fully had to do with their material conditions and their access to various resources, which means that capitalism developed into its monopoly stage in Europe first. Capital accumulated in Europe first, so they were the first imperialist country. So they were the first country to begin just expanding and controlling more and more with this financial oligarchy. So that's the reason that Africa and Latin America have been underdeveloped. It has nothing to do with the superiority of any one race. It has everything to do with material conditions and imperialism, which is why Marxism is the ultimate debunk, the ultimate refutation of race essentialism or racist ideology. There's nothing inherently different about any race of people. Every difference in societies and politics comes from material factors. So the reason that the Western countries were able to become the first imperialist countries had to do with material factors, which largely led the imperialized countries to become the first countries to develop and build socialism, which is different from what Marx predicted. Marx thought it would be the Western capitalist countries. So Lenin goes over 5 essential features of imperialism now. He does a Watch Mojo's top 5 features of capitalist imperialism. And I couldn't help but remember when I was reading this, there were a bunch of people on TikTok a while back who tried to project Lenin's 5 features of imperialism onto China. They were saying, look at Lenin's 5, Lenin lists these 5 types of imperialism, and China's doing all of these, so therefore they're imperialist, and that's where the analysis would end. So as I go through these, I'm also going to debunk why China is not imperialist. But so the number one essential feature of capitalist imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage. Monopolies play a decisive role in economic life. So again, capitalism develops into this monopoly stage, transforms into monopoly capitalism out of capitalism based on free competition. We've talked about that enough. Number 2, the second essential feature of imperialism, the merger of industry and banking capital into finance capital. So we've talked about this too. Once you have shareholders controlling banks as well as controlling industrial capital, this capital merges and concentrates together in various ways and creates finance capital, the merger of industrial or manufacturing capital and banking capital. And the banking, obviously, the invention of banking just gives capitalists way more ability to take out loans and develop new capital outlays. It allows them to move money much easier, make transactions a lot easier. So it just makes capital accumulation and expansion a lot easier and leads to the concentration of banking and industrial capital at the top of society. Also, you have the creation of a financial oligarchy on this basis. So this is very important. After capitalism develops out of its stage of free competition into its monopoly stage, the state, the government, becomes controlled by those monopolies, becomes controlled by the finance capitalists, by the bankers and industrial capitalists. And if you look at, any politician in the US's campaign donations today, or who lobbies them, it's banks and corporations, or generally industrial capitalists. You also have Silicon Valley capitalists, and as financialization and finance capital has continued to develop and increase in the US, years and years after Lenin was first analyzing it, we actually don't produce that much at all anymore. We don't have that many manufacturing capitalists anymore. They've outsourced a lot of their jobs to places they're imperializing. So really at the top of our society are finance capitalists, Silicon Valley capitalists, and like real estate oligarchs or landlord companies, as well as just shareholders like Bill Gates who have their arms everywhere. But I guess you could include that in Silicon Valley. But anyways, they're the ones who control the government. They're the ones who control the state. It is the banks and the oligarchs, the people who have the money, the people who write the politicians' checks, and the people who can lobby for specific bills. So after capitalism develops out of its stage of free competition, the capitalist free competition bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, is no longer in control of the state. You now have this financial oligarchy that's in control of the state. And that financial oligarchy controls, other countries' states with imperialist aggression. But here we see production, how things are produced and the relations of production leads to a change from free competition to monopoly capitalism. That is a shift in production, the relations of production and how things are produced. It's now monopoly capitalists stand atop the relation. As that changes, part of the superstructure changes, meaning the state changes, the government, politics. So it's not politics that are steering economics, at least not under capitalism or a system of anarchic production. It is production which is controlling the politics. The ruling class economically will always be the class which rules the state. Right? The ruling class, when Marx was looking at capitalism, was the national bourgeoisie, manufacturing capitalists who had evolved out of like merchants and guild owners under feudalism. When Lenin's looking at it, it's the monopolies, the financiers, the finance capitalists, and same today. Mostly same today. So in the US, we've outsourced so many jobs. Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to talk about. Yes. Okay. So that is the end of number 2. The second essential feature of imperialism, capitalist imperialism, is the creation of finance capital and an oligarchy on that basis. Number 3, the export of capital versus the export of commodities. So in the era of free competition, the I guess not original, but the stage of capitalism that Marx is looking at, commodities are the main thing that are exported. Country A trades commodities with country B. If I'm in the UK and we create a lot of wool, and this is what you'll learn in a micro or macroeconomics class if you learn it in the West, which is basically a pseudoscience, but whatever. If we grow wool in Europe and the US needs wool and they have steel that we need, I'll trade them some wool for their steel. We'll trade them the commodities that we produce if they trade us the commodities that they produce. Once capitalism develops into its monopoly stage and its imperialist stage, you now have the export of capital rather than commodities. Capital, and everyone should read Marx's Capital, but capital is basically value that creates more value when combined with labor. So capital is anything, the export of capital is the capitalist sending something that's going to be set up in this foreign country, in the imperialized country. It's going to be combined with labor. It's going to create a product. The capitalist is going to sell that product on the market, and it's going to make them money. It's going to make them profit. It's going to make them surplus value. Versus, just trading commodities for other commodities for consumption. Have the export of capital. So I used the example of the U.S. trading steel for the UK's wool before. The export of capital would be like the U.S., exporting or using the finance capital, using banks to fund the development of oil rigs in the UK, right? And then generally this is how imperialism works. The US will try and control the politics and the government of the UK, make it so there's no labor regulations, make it so wages are as low as possible and as little money as possible is being invested into the people of whatever country you're imperializing. Allow the transnational corporation to take all the profit, and then you just exploit the crap out of the resources and labor in that country using the capital you've exported there. So basically you're exporting an oil rig. You can think of it just like a vacuum and sucking up all the resources created by the labor and the raw materials in the country you're targeting. You're sucking up all those resources and bringing it to the home country, which is leading to capitalist accumulation and capitalist concentration and more monopolization in the imperial country. But it's preventing development and preventing capitalism from really developing in the imperialized country. They have this uneven, sporadic capitalist development where their economy develops around whatever capital has been exported there. And then they're having their resources and the value of their labor siphoned by Western capitalists rather than, investing that money in more capital and more productive capacity at home. So capital equals value that creates more value and mixed with labor and sold on a market. Yes. Exporting. Yes. And export capital at this time, as capitalism is developing into its monopoly stage, becomes increasingly important to the capitalist ruling class. So as they become more solidified in this imperialist monopoly stage, the more reliant they are on export capital, because export capital allows for super exploitation, right? These capitalists captured the home market in the U.S. Maybe they had their workers in the U.S. making $5 an hour or whatever. But then as they export capital, they realize they can get their profits and their surplus value even higher, right? They can pay workers in Bangladesh $1 an hour rather than paying their own workers $7 an hour. So they outsource jobs and lay off workers at home. And to outsource jobs, you have to have capital over there, right? You have to have something. You have to have buildings and tools for the workers to use. So export capital, or the profits of capitalists, are increasingly reliant on their export capital. And this is the situation that the U.S. empire is in today, where they have nearly 1,000 military bases abroad and all this international export capital, to the point where their profits are dependent upon it, which means their livelihoods are dependent upon it. So you have people like Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden who have been and Mitch McConnell, I mentioned the GOP ones too, Ted Cruz. These people who have been on top of this imperialist oligarchy, or have been running this imperialist oligarchy since the beginning, their profits and their livelihoods are dependent on maintaining the U.S. empire and maintaining their export capital and their control of foreign political systems. So they're like literally willing to push us towards nuclear war. They're just like willy-nilly about pushing us towards nuclear annihilation, because this is everything for them. Their whole life, their whole existence, and the production of their own means of subsistence boils down to imperialism, right? All of their wealth and status and power is based on that. And that's why we have to overthrow this oligarchic class if we're going to defeat the empire and save the world, maybe, honestly, because I feel like they literally will push us into nuclear war before they give up their export capital. But something else I want to mention, maybe I had it later in my notes, but I just want to talk about it now. Export capital prevents countries from developing, as does imperialism in general. So Lenin talks about in here how wherever capital is exported, because at his time, capital is being exported to countries who have had no capitalist development, right? Countries where capitalism doesn't exist. In that case, export capital is helping capitalism develop more quickly, right? It's bringing capital and productive forces and infrastructure to these countries. So then it allows capitalism to grow and for more capital to accumulate. that's right away, right? That's what Lenin is observing as capitalism is, just entered its monopoly stage and divided up the world and carrying on with capitalist imperialism. But as imperialism develops and as, the US develops these different things like their structural adjustment loans, which are loans from the IMF and the World Bank that have strings attached, we're only going to give you this financing if you cut labor regulations and bust up unions for us. As the US gets better at techniques like that, techniques of controlling the countries they're trying to imperialize, they actually hold back development. They prevent development. So Venezuela is a great example. Obviously, I use Venezuela as an example a lot because I'm doing a book on it right now. So it just makes it easy. But they got what's called Dutch disease, what modern economists call Dutch disease. And that's when you have one industry in your country that's so strong that it causes all of the other industries to lag behind. And your economy becomes dependent on that one industry. So that was oil in Venezuela. They have the largest oil reserves in the world. That's not because Venezuela is just dumb, and they never diversified their economy. It's because Western multinational oil companies were siphoning out their oil for years. They had export capital set up, oil rigs, and they continually siphoned Venezuela's oil and sold that oil on the market, global market. And then all of the money from Venezuela's oil created by the labor of Venezuelan workers was taken by the U.S. imperialists, was taken by the oligarchs, these giant transnational multi-gajillion dollar oil companies who set up shop in Venezuela. And it made their economy completely dependent on oil to the point where when they had a socialist government take power, the transition to socialism, the construction of socialism was very difficult because all the U.S. had to do was disrupt the sale of oils or disrupt the sale of oil or oil prices, global oil prices, and they could largely hamper Venezuela's socialist economy and the funding of their social programs. And then, the U.S. points at Venezuela. My economics professor from college points at Venezuela and goes, "Oh, socialism has failed every time. Look how dependent they are on oil." It's like capitalist imperialism is what made them dependent on oil. Export capital is what made them dependent on oil. Socialism is what's diversifying their economy. So yeah, export capital and imperialism prevent countries from developing their productive forces, which is largely what has given impetus to the masses in those countries to rise up and be the first countries to establish socialism. Masses. Yeah, I think that's all I got on that for now. Oh, yeah. There's one more thing I wanted to say. And once you have, once economics and global production develops to a new stage and you have these sort of camps, socialist versus capitalist camps, and socialist countries trying to combat imperialism, which is something Lenin didn't see until he led the revolution that created the USSR. The US will just bomb these countries or destroy their infrastructure because they act as competition globally. And they would do this, if there were private firms in countries they don't like, they're totally willing to just bomb and destroy their global competition. But the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia is just a really obvious example because they bombed 179 state-run factories, Yugoslav manufacturing facilities that were competitors with the U.S. on the global market. Right? Yugoslavia had developed, or at least Serbia had developed pretty efficient system of manufacturing. They were exporting a lot of goods globally and then using the returns on the money they made on that to try and construct and develop socialism, despite the U.S. sanctions and whatnot. And the U.S., after doing everything they could to dismantle Yugoslavia and make it neoliberal, Serbia was still not becoming neoliberal. They still had all these state-run factories. So the U.S. just went in with bombs and destroyed it, or NATO. Think how destructive that is, dropping bombs on 179 different manufacturing facilities, places where people work, where they have their livelihood, and where the necessary commodities or the means of subsistence for these societies are produced. And the U.S. is just like, oh, that brings too much market competition. Bomb them. I mean, capitalist imperialism is truly the most irrational economic system. Let's bomb the manufacturing facilities that create the means of subsistence because they're competing with us on the global market. How about you let people produce what they want and trade with them? Psychopaths, but capitalist imperialism is not rational. So yeah, export capital holds the productive forces from developing, holds them back. Blah, blah. We need more athletic Chad bros like you to spread socialism instead of pretentious liberal coffee shop hipsters. Keep up the good work. Thank you, comrade. I agree. I mean, nothing wrong with working at a coffee shop, of course, but yeah, we need to popularize communism. Communism right now in the U.S. just has a reputation of being like liberal, right? Like everybody who's a communist is basically just a super radical liberal. Who thinks that Ben Shapiro should be banned from speaking on college campuses. That's not really it, but, and we want, as many people on board with communism as possible. So I'm not saying we should exclude anyone from the movement because of their lack of masculinity or something. But I don't know. It is nice to have people who are like in sports, people who are, from different backgrounds advocating for communism, because it's something we haven't had in the U.S. forever because we're such an anti-communist country. A buddy, it wasn't a buddy, but it was a commentator who said they were from China a while back, and I didn't check to see if they actually were. But they said, you guys should try and get celebrities on your side in the U.S., right? Americans love celebrities so much, and celebrities oftentimes will, talk about socialism or communism or politics or whatever. If you can get some socialist or communist celebrities, take advantage of it. Use them to rally people around. The one that I've really started trying to do that with is Russell Brand, because Russell Brand is great. I don't know if he's a communist, but he just calls out the left, quote unquote left, meaning the neoliberals, and the right, the neoconservatives. And he's pretty funny. A lot of people like him as an actor. So check out Russell Brand's YouTube if you haven't. But yeah, it's always good to have, we need leaders and people to look up to. And if some people think that's me, thank you. I don't know if I'd call myself a Chad, but if you call me that, I'll accept. Okay. Number 4, Lenin's fourth essential feature of imperialism is the formation of internationalist capitalist monopolies who share the division of the world amongst themselves. So you have these monopolies who fully dominate their home market, right? Capitalism has spread everywhere in Europe, and then it starts spreading to America and the American North. Eventually, capitalism has taken hold everywhere. Or, the capitalist imperialist countries who have accumulations of wealth are exporting capital and bringing capitalism, albeit in a colonial form, to the countries who haven't had capitalism yet. So imperialism actually spreads capitalism everywhere, even though it prevents the productive forces from developing evenly in some countries. It also brings capitalism everywhere through violence, right? And through military force, basically. And I mean, the slaughter of the indigenous people, of various nations. I was going to say the Iroquois people in the Americas, but a lot of people, the mass slaughter of them, and enslavement even, and just the destruction and the complete conquering of their homeland is probably the best example. The best example I can think of, and a good example for Americans because it's our history. But the native populations, the indigenous populations had their own mode of production, right? They had a communal mode of production for the most part. Maybe not, they did have like commodity circulation in various ways, but they certainly didn't have capitalism, right? They had their own economy. In order for capitalism to take hold, it has to wipe out the economy that came before it. So you see capitalist imperialism destroying this indigenous economy, and killing many indigenous people in order to set up capitalism and bring capital to the quote unquote new world. So this happened all over the place. Capitalism, the capitalist countries divided up the world amongst themselves. And eventually you have the full division of the world by these capitalist monopolies or international monopolies, which leads us to number 5, Lenin's 5th and final essential characteristic of capitalist imperialism is complete territorial division of the world among great powers. So as we said earlier, there's no longer anywhere else to go that other capitalist powers haven't conquered yet. There's no more new places to kill a bunch of people and set up capitalism and call it your own colony. So now the capitalist imperialist countries whose profits are dependent on accumulation and are now dependent on export capital and imperialism, they begin fighting with each other over the colonies. And this is actually what's going to lead into World War I, which Lenin calls the Great Imperialist War, which is really what it is, a bunch of capitalist superpowers fighting each other over the colonies. So something interesting here with number 5, the complete territorial division of the world amongst great powers. Most of us living in the modern era are used to a unipolar world. We're used to a U.S. dominated world, a world dominated by the Western financial oligarchy, mostly oligarchs and shareholders and banks in London and Wall Street in the U.S. But that was a development, as I said earlier, that came after World War II. Right, that happened after World War II when much of the fighting had gone down in Europe and the Soviet Union. Their infrastructure was largely destroyed. Then the U.S. dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, and it left the U.S. as the dominant unipolar hegemonic global force and the main global force of imperialism. So that hadn't happened before Lenin, right? During Lenin's time, in the lead up to World War I, or during World War I, depending on what you're talking about, there are multiple capitalist powers competing with each other that are about the same. You have Germany, France, the UK, Japan, and then later the US, who are all competing with each other and fighting for the colonies, which is how they got sucked into World War I. So it's a different situation than the unipolar US. You have multiple capitalist imperialist rivals, and before the creation of the dominant unipolar Western financial oligarchy. Yes, and that's all I had to say about that, except for the people trying to apply the 5 essential features of imperialism to China and trying to just cherry pick Lenin's 5 essentials and act like it's a Watch Mojo top 5 and be like, well, China also kind of has this. Right? It's like, take the export of capital versus commodities for an example. It's just funny because you have Westerners, Americans on TikTok, who are like, I just opened Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. China has monopolies and they export capital, so they're imperialist too. They're the same as the U.S. Done. Post to TikTok. And it's like, you don't think the Chinese people, the Chinese Marxist intellectuals, the people who have been constructing socialism for over 70 years now, who have been a Marxist Leninist revolutionary country for that many years now, you don't think they understand Lenin and his theory of imperialism and export capital? Like, no, it's the fact that China understands Marx and Lenin so well that they're able to do what they do. Right? If they didn't understand export capital, the Belt and Road Initiative wouldn't work. Because people accuse China of trying to debt trap countries by giving them developmental loans, trying to do the same thing the IMF and the World Bank do. Give them a loan and then jack up the interest rate and say, if you don't do everything we say, we're going to keep you in debt forever, and jack up the interest rates even more. Americans love to project that on China, right? And they'll open up their copy of Lenin's Imperialism and be like, export capital, that's a thing that China does. You're imperialist too. It's mostly just capitalist projection. China is very careful with how they export capital. One, there's a policy of complete non-interventionism, which you can look at. Yanis Varoufakis has a good talk about this. Complete non-interventionism. They will not meddle with the politics of any country, and they will trade with every country. We were talking about earlier on stream, why does China trade with Duterte in the Philippines or with Israel or with Colombia? It's because they have a trade policy of complete non-interventionism. And this is to counter the IMF and the World Bank, the U.S. imperialist financial institutions, who do make countries change their politics and labor regulations in exchange for loans. The other thing, China keeps around a 4% interest rate on all of these loans. Right? The IMF and the World Bank interest rates have gotten as high as like 40%. They're just ridiculous, or even more than that. They just trap countries in this never-ending spiral of debt, which is why it's called a debt trap or a structural adjustment loan. Because you give them a loan, which comes at a price of adjusting the entire structure of your economy and of your politics. So China doesn't have that, and they don't have the interest rates either. So they're not trapping countries in debt. People tried to blame Sri Lanka's debt crisis that they recently had on China. Again, just complete projection. We covered this on stream. Like 88% of Sri Lanka's debt they owe to Western financial institutions. A big chunk of it is the IMF and the World Bank, and the other chunks of it are like the Asian Development Bank, which, as we talked about earlier, is controlled by the US and the IMF and the World Bank. And what was I saying? I totally forgot the rant I was on. Sorry. Thank you, Frick Frack, for the $2 super sticker. Woohoo! But I don't know. I know what I was talking about in general. But either way, China avoids putting a ton of interest on these loans, and what they've basically copied, which Marxism is looking at production, looking at economics, and figuring out what works and what doesn't. Right? It's not dogmatism. It's not this dogmatic ideology that I accuse Marxist-Leninist Maoists of having in the modern day. It is about adapting. So what China realized is that after World War II, the U.S., through the Marshall Plan, gave a bunch of developmental loans to their allies in West Europe. So the U.S.'s allies had undergone all this fighting. Communism was sweeping across the continents of Asia and Europe. So the U.S. wanted to control Western Europe, keep them as an ally, one, so the U.S. could trade with them, but two, to help them combat the communist countries, help them sort of act as this imperialist hegemon. So they gave the Western Europe these 4% interest loans through the Marshall Plan, and Europe paid off those loans like a decade ago or so, and it really helped rebuild their economy and jumpstart their economy after World War II. Their infrastructure, their productive forces had been destroyed by the fighting. These small interest loans came in, gave them the financing to invest, to develop themselves, develop their productive base, which allowed them to be prosperous and allies of the U.S. for years to come without ever getting trapped in debt. This is what China is doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. The interest rates on these loans are around 4%, very, very, very similar to the Marshall Plan. So China looked at what worked in the past, whether it's something that they did or the USSR did or something their enemies like the US did, and they used it. They used what worked and altered it for their own conditions and what they need. And so basically they took Lenin's concept of export capital, or Lenin's concept of countries' finance capital getting countries trapped in debt. And they found a way to export capital and use developmental loans within global capitalism in a way that doesn't work like U.S. export capital, in a way that increases development rather than preventing development. So that's why it's so funny to me when TikTokers are like, oh, Lenin says the five rules of imperialism are export capital. China exports capital. They're imperialist. Because China understands Lenin so well, that's why they're able to create these systems which combat the U.S. systems of imperialism. And yet you have Westerners getting on TikTok to be like, oh, China, have you ever read Lenin? Yeah, I think they have. But what was the last thing I was going to say? I don't remember. I'm losing my train of thought here now. We've been at it for a while. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The last thing I was going to say is China's Belt and Road Initiative, too, is a counter to imperialism, which is another thing that Western Marxists have a really hard time understanding, is everything that these countries have to do is in counter to imperialism, in countering the U.S., trying to overthrow them and prevent them from developing at all in every way possible, which is, something very, very important that Lenin figures out for the first time in this book. But obviously most Americans still don't understand it. When you hear something like, oh, China has this firewall, right? There's a firewall between the US and China. So they don't have access to, American Western internet. And the way our media portrays that is they're controlling your freedom of speech. They just don't want their citizens to know the truth. When in reality, Twitter just did this or passed this new community guideline law or whatever that's going to allow them to crack down on freedom of speech, to control civic discourse. And they explicitly say because the midterm elections are coming up. So we have Silicon Valley oligarchs telling us that they're going to control our social media here in the US, but we call China a dictatorship because they have a firewall. The firewall is to prevent the US from doing what they did in Libya and Syria, and honestly in Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua at this point we now know, which is sending a bunch of online actors controlling the social media spaces, using bot accounts, controlling algorithms, manipulating online messaging, and using social media to create regime change and to organize regime change. That's largely what the U.S. did in Libya and Syria, what they call the Arab Spring, was infiltrated their social media in order to organize extremist rebels and bring them together and create a coalition, which in Libya and Syria, it was known as the Libyan something coalition and the Syrian opposition coalition, which is literally just a group of extremists that the U.S. empire basically welded together in order to carry out regime change. So then China, of course, is going to block the U.S. from doing that. Why would, if you look at the U.S.'s history of controlling social media and using it to create regime change, why would you not have a firewall between your country and the U.S.? But nobody sees that. Nobody sees that China's actions and their politics are always in response to imperialism, are always a way to combat imperialism. We just look at them in a vacuum, or that's how the American corporate media wants us to look at it. Oh, China has this firewall because they hate the free internet. They hate freedom of speech. Meanwhile, in the U.S., we're trying to pass SOPA, which would allow just a bunch of corporations to basically shut down any internet page or website they don't like. And we have Google and Twitter, openly admitting that they're continuing to control the algorithm and censor what people say to fight disinformation. Even though things like the Ukrainian biolabs were called disinformation for like months before later being admitted by the U.S. State Department that they were true and weren't disinformation the whole time. But I digress. We know that all imperialist accusations against existing socialism are just projection. We know this at this point. All right, so after Lenin looks at, the complete territorial division of the world leads into the first imperialist war, World War I, where they're fighting each other over the colonies. So this is Lenin analyzing how capitalism changed from its free development stage into its monopoly capital imperialist stage, using dialectics, or this will help us understand dialectics. So a quantitative, meaning something you can count, something tangible, a quantitative increase in banks and finance capital creates a qualitative change in capitalism itself. A qualitative change, meaning an observable change, a change that you can't measure, meaning capitalism transforms from a system of free development, of free competition, into a system of monopoly, monopoly capital and imperialist capitalism. That's a qualitative change in capitalism. It's now at a new stage. It's the same thing, but it's developed into a different thing based on that same thing. So it's the quantitative increase in banks, right? So you can count the number of banks that increase. The U.S. and Germany and France, they add 5 new banks, and then they add 7 new banks over there. Okay, add them up, that's 12. And you can't pinpoint it with something like this and say that's exactly where capitalism transformed into monopoly capital. But overall, or at some point, the quantitative increases in banks and finance capital led to a qualitative increase in capitalism. A qualitative change in capitalism. So the banks go up numerically, and then once the banks have full economic control, and full political control, once there's a financial oligarchy, capitalism has changed qualitatively, right? You can't necessarily measure the difference in free or capitalism in its free competition stage versus capitalism in its monopoly stage. It's something you can observe, but it can't be measured. You can measure the number of banks, right? You can say capitalism in its monopoly stage has a quantitatively higher number of banks, which leads to this qualitative change. So the quantitative increases or quantitative changes are what eventually lead to like a breaking point or a breakthrough or a sublation, which leads to a qualitative change. And this is just an example, and Lenin applying dialectics to analyze capitalism as it develops. Really applying Marxist theory of dialectical materialism in the most beautiful way to continue Marx's analysis of capitalism. So shout out to our boy Vlad. He really is the man. So Lenin at this point goes into a criticism of Kautsky, who was one of his major intellectual rivals at the time. Was Kautsky the leader of the Mensheviks, or was he leader of like Social Democrats? I don't remember the political landscape completely at this time. So Kautsky was the Social Democratic Party of Germany. So Kautsky would pretend to be a Marxist. He said he was a Marxist, but Lenin would criticize him for being a reformist, basically for being just a social democrat, a sock dem, a Bernie bro. Bernie bro in Russia. So Lenin says that Kautsky calls imperialism a policy, not a stage of capitalism. This is his flaw. So you hear people say this a lot today. You know, imperialism is violence. I actually made a video saying this one time. I was wrong about what imperialism was, and I've since learned and corrected my errors. I said imperialist is violence for capital accumulation or for capitalist expansion. And that's not what it is. Imperialism is an economic system, right? Kautsky thought it was just political violence. Government A wants to take over government B, so they do it. They engage in a war against government B. And Lenin says, you're just looking at the superstructure. This is an idealist way to look at it. You're only looking at the politics. The politics are driven by the economics. And the economics of imperialism are monopoly and export capital. So you have to analyze these things like export capital and the change from free competition into monopoly capitalism if you're going to understand imperialism as an economic system. And you have to understand it as an economic system if you're going to understand it at all. Otherwise, things don't make any sense. Otherwise, you're going to look at Venezuela, right? And somebody's going to tell you that Venezuela failed because socialism. And you're going to be like, that must be right. You know, because their economy is dependent on oil and they're dealing with economic hardships due to ignoring the U.S. sanctions. That must be right. Socialism must have failed. Otherwise, why would they be so dependent on oil? When really they're dependent on oil because of the U.S. export capital. Because capitalism and imperialism is an economic system, and the U.S. capitalists use that system by exporting capital to exploit Venezuela. That gave Venezuela Dutch disease. That made Venezuela's economy dependent on oil. It had everything to do with export capital. So if you don't understand this, if you don't understand how imperialism works at a material and at an economic or at a productive level, and if you just understand it as a policy like Kautsky, you're never going to be able to fight it, right? And you're never going to be able to combat imperialism with socialism, which is the only thing that can attack imperialism at its foundations. You're just going to be arguing like I was when I was a sophomore in college. Let's just vote for enough Bernie Sanders and enough AOCs, and then eventually imperialism will go away because then we'll control the government, we'll control the politics, and imperialism is just a policy. No, there's a reason Bernie voted in favor of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. It's because imperialism is an economic system and Bernie is part of that system. There's a giant machinery of imperialism that's set up. The financial oligarchy, the global financial oligarchy of the U.S. helps maintain and continue this economic system of imperialism. That's really the economic system of capitalist imperialism in its more developed stage, even since the era of Lenin. is this domination of banks and the global financial system, as well as the creation of groups like NATO, which can act as a military apparatus of imperialism without even being attached to a country. Right? We're just NATO. It's not the U.S. doing these things, just NATO, which is another development of imperialism, really. But Kautsky, in Lenin's critique, said makes the national question the only question. So he reduces imperialism to the national question because he's reducing imperialism to an economic, or not an economic system, but a political policy. So he's saying, all we need to do is bring about self-determination, and imperialism's done for. There's no more imperialism or colonialism. Once the capitalist imperialist countries, once the UK and France and the US don't have their colonies anymore, and once the global south has flag independence, once Upper Volta becomes Burkina Faso, then we have freedom. Then we have no more imperialism, which is, basically you see Kautsky, who's a self-described Marxist, his positions are falling in line with liberalism, with what liberals would say every step of the way, because that's what liberals would say. Colonialism ended after World War II. There were these anti-colonial struggles, and all these countries were given flag independence. They have independence now. And what Lenin is saying is, no, imperialism isn't just politics. Imperialism isn't just flag independence. Because imperialism is an economic system, these countries can gain their flag independence and still be controlled by Western finance capitalists. The banks and the oligarchs oligarchs, and industrial capitalists can control that territory and keep full control of the politics covertly, or by investing, or by using export capital, or by using NGOs, or by using structural adjustment loans, because they dominate the entire global financial system. So even though there are a lot of countries who gain their flag independence and bring an end to direct colonialism, we see capitalism evolve and turn into this form of neo-colonialism, where the financial oligarchies are still controlling the economies, just doing it in a more covert, subtle way, rather than directly controlling the sovereign and stripping that country of their sovereignty. You'll let the people in that country vote as long as the people they're voting for are U.S.-backed, U.S.-funded candidates. And as long as the financial system and the banks and the economy is controlled by the Western finance capitalists. You can elect whoever you want, just don't touch the economy. Otherwise, the U.S. is coming for you with a regime change effort. So again, all of this stuff is stuff that you'll miss if you don't see imperialism as an economic system. It makes your analysis worse. It makes you miss things in your analysis and just think of imperialism as a political phenomena, which it's not, and it never has been. Imperialism is an economic system of exploitation, territory, resources, and labor, a stage of capitalism. Mistakes come if you don't understand imperialism this way. I wrote that in my notes, but I just said it to you right now, so good job, me. The example I have in my notes, you won't understand Russia and Ukraine, right? So you have socialists with Ukraine flags in their bio talking about how Russia is the rival imperialist power to the U.S., or Russia is doing the same thing that the U.S. has done, or they're doing the same thing in Ukraine that the U.S. did in Iraq. I've literally heard people say that. This is what happens when you understand imperialism as a political policy rather than as an economic system. Right? If you don't understand it as an economic system and understand the covert methods of imperialism, or how imperialism in the modern era is actually enforced and carried out, you won't see the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014. You won't see the NATO training of troops in Ukraine, the destabilization of Ukrainian politics for years, or you won't see the constant expansion of NATO, this imperialist military apparatus that destroyed Libya and tried to destroy Syria and carpet-bombed Yugoslavia, constantly creeping, encroaching on Russia's borders. Or you won't see the U.S.'s economic actions, trying to control the economies. You won't see Russia's economic actions. After the USSR fell and U.S. Western multinational companies plundered Russia's state-run companies and plundered their whole economy, put them into an economic disaster. And then Putin nationalized a handful of the energy companies and parts of the energy sector, a socialistic economic policy, and reinvested that money in developing Russia. in developing Russia's infrastructure. So they moved away from neoliberalism, moved more towards socialism, and then started trading with all these countries who the U.S. is trying to destroy. Started trading with Venezuela, started trading with Iran, started trading with Syria, sent some troops to help stabilize the situation in Syria when the U.S. was trying to destroy the country. This is not Russia being imperialist because they sent troops to Syria, right? The U.S. is carrying out economic capitalist imperialism. Russia is trying to bring some political stability so that these countries can combat that. The situation in Ukraine is different, but people are saying Russia is the imperialist power in Ukraine and the U.S. is not. Russia's, not to say that their motivations, that there weren't some economic motivations. I think they do want to build a land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea, but that's not why they invaded, right? They invaded because it was a threat to their national security. So it was a political motivation. You had neo-Nazis and the U.S.-backed extremists killing people, killing basically Russians in the Donbass. NATO is training troops. As NATO is, has continually expanded towards Russia's borders, the U.S. is putting sanctions on Russia. The U.S. is trying to turn their allies against Russia and China. The NATO summit that Vijay Prashad wrote about recently said that the main goal of the U.S. empire and of NATO and the financial oligarchy going into it was like in 2018 or something when they had the summit, their main goal is to target Russia and China, destroy Russia and China. Because economically, Russia and China are threatening the capitalist unipolar world order. They're threatening the dominance of Western finance capital and the financial oligarchy. So the U.S. is doing everything they can to destroy them. And Russia made a calculation that, they should invade Ukraine, take out these extremist political actors who want to threaten Russia at the behest of the U.S., and do what they said is denazify. It's very different from invading a country and exporting a bunch of capital there. Invading a country, toppling their government and occupying them, or like the U.S. did in Libya, just toppling them and leaving them with no central government, and then just setting up a bunch of oil rigs so you can extract their wealth. That's just simply not what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And unless you have this economic understanding of imperialism, you're going to miss this. Right, because you're just going to be like, well, Russia did an invasion. Invasion equals political violence equals imperialism, because imperialism is a political policy, right? No, unless Russia, starts setting up export capital in Ukraine or destabilizes their central government so that Russia can control their politics completely and start setting up capital and exploiting the crap out of the country. Unless Russia starts doing that, they're not acting as a capitalist imperialist power. And I highly doubt that that's what we're going to see Russia do here in the near future. It would make no sense. Without an economic understanding of imperialism, it's impossible to see how the U.S. were the aggressors in Ukraine. And that's why, or it's impossible to see how Ukraine is a proxy war led by the U.S. against Russia. And it's easy to see why liberals in the U.S. who see everything as political, who only focus on politics and the government and the actions of the state and pretty much just ignore the economy and just have this dogmatic adherence to the market. It's easy to see how American liberals are missing the situation in Ukraine, or, just yelling Slava Ukraini and putting Ukraine flags in their bio with no idea that they're supporting IDAR and Right Sector and the Azov Battalion, these U.S.-backed extremists. Which is the problem with liberalism in general. This is why people in Cuba and China and countries who have been doing Marxist socialist education for a while understand better what's going on in the world. They understand better what's going on in Ukraine because they see what the U.S. has done in Ukraine. One, there's not the corporate media propaganda that we're inundated with here. But two, they have a dialectical understanding of the world and of society. So they're able to see the economic acts of imperialism that the U.S. carried out. Economic and political. So that was a long rant, but it's very relevant. And you see how relevant this book is today? You see how relevant it is today? Everything in this book, I can relate it to something from today. Craziness. 1917, he wrote this bad boy. But anyways, Kautsky only thought industrial capitalists were the ones fueling imperialism, and they were seeking annexation or the control of various countries. But it's finance capital, not industrial capital. And imperialism equals violence or reactionary politics, or fascism, only from a political point of view. Right? That's how imperialism acts politically. It acts reactionary and violently, but that political head is driven by the economic body. Right? It's not just this rogue state deciding to invade a bunch of other countries because it feels like it. Right? That's not what the U.S. is doing. It's the financial oligarchy who controls the U.S. who seeks to control markets and territory and labor elsewhere. And they are the ones who control the state and do imperialism, not the other way around. And this is why libertarians are goofy. They're like, just get rid of the government. It's like, who controls the government, guys? The capitalists, the banks. Anyways, so you need an economic perspective. You need to look at a perspective from the point of view of production if you're going to truly understand imperialism and how to fight against it. So some people argue that imperialism was capitalism progressing, and therefore it's good and should be supported because it's progressive and it's moving capitalism forward and it's something different, a new stage of capitalism. And anything progressive is good. And Lenin is like, what the hell are you guys talking about? Imperialism is just the newest form of capital accumulation and exploitation. It's just them realizing they can super exploit countries if they colonize them. And while imperialism does spread capitalism everywhere and create the possibility of socialism and create the possibility of global revolution and global communism, that doesn't mean it's good. Just because it spreads capitalism does not mean it's good. You can build socialism without having capitalism first. This has been proven by history. So Lenin critiques those guys. And he critiques Kautsky and others who say that eventually imperialism is gonna hit this ultra-imperialist stage, right? So all of the imperialist countries who are currently fighting each other, they're gonna form into an ultra-imperialist alliance, and then they'll stop fighting. Right? They'll exploit people, but they'll stop doing imperialist wars, political imperialism. Obviously, this hasn't happened. We've seen the creation and the formation of a Western financial oligarchy, a financial oligarchy based in London and Wall Street, which uses the political apparatuses or the militaries or the states of West Europe and the U.S. and North America, really, not Mexico anymore, but uses those states to carry out imperialist action. So it's sort of an international financial oligarchy, but that was happening at Lenin's time too. Right. So there was no evidence or no reason to believe that there would be a super imperialist alliance and they would just stop fighting eventually. It's just reformism. And again, you see Kautsky here basically just being a liberal, pretending to be a Marxist, masquerading as a Marxist like a lot of people do, without having any Marxist analysis of imperialism. Just basically taking liberal positions, right? Don't do anything about imperialism. It'll go away eventually. Okay, well, just because you're calling yourself a Marxist doesn't make that any less of a liberal imperialist position. And it's actually worse, if Marxists are calling themselves Marxists and then, being liberals in practice. So it's just interesting. As I was talking about earlier, this book is so relevant for today, even though it was written in 1917. And when you compare Lenin's theory of imperialism to the other theories of imperialism at the time, like Kautsky's super imperialism, it's just not even close. It's not even close. Like Lenin's has held up so much better. Because Lenin's analysis of imperialism was based on evidence. He looked at the world around him. There's a ton of statistics in this book where he's looking at the increase of banks and the increase of export capital and the various mergers of banks and industrial capital into finance capital all over the capitalist world. And he's using this to prove his arguments versus liberal idealists or, fake Marxists like Kautsky. They can just be like, well, imperialism will go away eventually. Trust me. And because their analysis is not rooted in evidence and what is real, what is material, it ends up becoming outdated very fast and not useful very fast. And it's, wrong at the time it was written, as Lenin points out. But now looking back with hindsight, it's like, obviously Lenin was right. And the reason why he was right was because he was using dialectical and historical materialism, because Marx was right too. So Lenin, as I said, he's got a lot of stats in here to prove his claims. A lot of them are kind of obvious, like the domination of finance capital. You just see how much railways and banks are skyrocketing in number. So talking about how like the quantitative increase in railways and banks can lead to changes in society overall, or changes in the economy overall. Like the increase of railways allowed for other commodities to be transported, right? You can connect cities to other cities, and bring commodities from one place to another very fast. So with the increase in railways, there's a massive increase in commerce, right? There's a massive increase in trade. Commodities are circulating much, much, much faster. And people begin to have, fetishize commodities much, much more. And people begin to seek out wealth accumulation as an end in itself more. This happens as commerce increases. And I talked about this earlier with the banks, but the banks allow for capitalists to move their capital around much, much quicker, right? If I'm a capitalist in the West, before the advent of banking, if I want to export capital to one of the colonies, it's going to be pretty difficult. Right. But once I have banking set up and there's all these arms of financial imperialism all over the world, the capitalist in the West can use money in a bank in the global South to fund his operations and fund export capital. So it makes money much more fluid, brings a massive increase to commerce and overall economic activity. At this time, we also see increased globalization, which is, pretty obvious. Globalization is characterized by like the export capital, or the creation of these international monopolies who seek to control the economy globally rather than just in their home market. So there's much more interaction and economic activity between various nations as capitalism develops, much more trade between countries and capitalists and countries. The formation of multinationals and international banks and industries become much more common. So we see the embryo or the first movement toward globalization, which really started coming about, as soon as capitalism came about, because capitalism always accumulates and expands. So Lenin also here interestingly notes that struggle in South America is increasing. So it's becoming more acute. And Lenin says this is because of resistance to imperialism. Imperialism has been so brutal and autocratic and dictatorial there that the people are rising up and they're, becoming the first people to try and create a revolution and construct socialism. So this is beginning to invert that old school Marxist idea that for some reason is held by communists, or, some ultra communists to this day. Not so much anymore, but in the era of Che and Fidel in Cuba, there were a lot of communists arguing this idea against Che and Fidel that the world just works like a video game. And before you have socialism, you have to have capitalism. So, the countries who have feudalism first will develop into capitalism. And then those countries, the Western European countries who had capitalism first, will develop into socialism. I don't know if Marx ever explicitly said this, but it's an idea that often gets attributed to him. And obviously it's not what happened. What happened is the opposite. The countries who were under the boot of imperialism, their productive forces were prevented from developing, leading the people to see the development of the capitalist imperialist countries and want to kick those countries out, kick out the financial oligarchs who controlled their economy and controlled their territory, and construct socialism. So obviously Russia was an imperialist country. They were an underdeveloped imperialist country, though. They weren't a fully developed capitalist country. They still had a massive peasantry. And then you have countries like Vietnam, who had an anti-colonial struggle. The DPRK had an anti-colonial struggle prior to establishing socialism. Cuba, all these countries who were under the boot of imperialism begin being the first ones to throw off the shackles of capitalism and begin building socialism. So this kind of inverts that Marxist idea. It's sort of a dialectical shift that you have with the imperialist stage of capitalism. No longer is the greatest potential for socialism in the Western imperialist capitalist countries, but in the countries they're targeting and exploiting. So yeah, that's all for that chapter about imperialism as a stage of capitalism. Just to recap and summarize, I think that was a good segment. I'm glad we did that and laid out the basics for a lot of people. But the reason I hit on that one is because it shows us a lot about dialectics, right? If you don't understand dialectical materialism, hopefully you understand it better now. We have, capitalism is always changing. It's always in development. This is one of the core principles of dialectics. You have the stage of free competition through development becomes its opposite, the monopoly domination. Quantitative change leads to qualitative change. The quantitative change and increase in the banks and the railroads and the industry led to a qualitative change in capitalism. Quantitative is something we can count. So a quantitative increase in banks leads to a qualitative change in capitalism. Capitalism changes how it functions as a totality due to quantitative changes within it, within capitalism. The banks are a part of capitalism. They are inside of it. They constitute capitalism itself. And through quantitative changes in those banks, which are internal to capitalism, capitalism qualitatively becomes something else as a whole. Very, again, essential principle of dialectics and something that Lenin applies here to capitalism's further development after Marx, and something that we can use and look at to help us understand dialectics. Especially for me, like I said, I'm probably a little biased towards this book because I did get my bachelor's in political science and I mostly studied geopolitics and how different countries interact. And this book just illuminated so much for me in terms of how countries interact and understanding how they're driven by their economic systems. But it also helped me understand dialectics, right? Because I understood imperialism, right? I understood pretty well. Yeah, I can't get rid of these spam accounts. Sorry. I understood pretty well the global political situation and kind of the economic situation. And seeing Lenin analyze that global political situation that I already knew about using dialectical materialism really, really helped me understand dialectical materialism and helped me understand some of the principles of it. And I also like this because it shows, without a doubt, we need, Marx's analysis is not enough. Marx did not write the Bible. Marxism is not a dogma, right? We call it Marxism because it started with Marx, but it could have been anybody else who made up the theory, right? That's just a name. What it really is, as Gabriel Rockhill says, is a living, breathing collective science, right? A living, breathing collective science that we're constantly developing, constantly adding to, constantly changing, just like everything in the world, because things are in a constant state of change. This is what dialectics tell us. And Marxism is being applied as things change and as time passes. And the Marxist analysis is constantly being updated and innovated. And the principles remain the same, right? The core principles of dialectical materialism remain the same in understanding how production changes the rest of society. But society itself and production itself changes. So, because it's in this constant state of change, we're going to need to be, as humans, in a constant state of updating our analysis, updating our theory. And this is what Lenin does better than anyone else who ever lived after Marx, probably. He has understood Marx and Hegel so well, applied their analysis to capitalism's changing forms so well. And that's what we need today. Marx is great. Read Marx, understand the principles of dialectical materialism, understand the basics, but then we have to apply that lens to our modern world. Yeah. So, one sec. I guess I'll read the chat for a little bit here. I have another chapter planned out that I want to summarize, but hit the chat up for a bit. Shout out Troika. Definitely. I love Troika Collective. We were talking about them the other day. They're goated with the sauce. The bots' names themselves are the spam messages. Yes. Russian motivation is Crimea, the only port in the region has to trade on the world scale, a world crucial port that the U.S. has placed sanctions against Russia. Okay, so this is a good point by Cobra Commander. So I said that the Russians might be motivated by building a land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea, but that's still not, economic imperialism, and that's not their main motivation. But Cobra Commander says that is their main motivation, because the only port in the region, that's the only port in the region that allows them to trade on the world scale. So it's very, very crucial, which is why the U.S. has placed sanctions on that area. So I was wrong in saying that Russia's main motivation wasn't economic, or that it was political, right? That it was national security concerns, which it partially is too. But because imperialism is an economic system, Russia's motivations for anti-imperialism are also based in economics, right? The U.S. is trying to sanction and cut off this port to hamper Russian production, to hamper Russian commerce, to hamper the Russian economy overall. So Russia needs to control this area if they're going to be able to ship their goods and combat imperialism, combat the sanctions. So my main point here is that everything has its basis in economics, especially when it comes to geopolitics, right? Russia was protecting their national security, yes, but what protects their national security more than anything is having access to this port. Right, having access to this economic stability, which prevents the U.S. from being able to wage economic warfare on them. Great point, comrades. Man, I love our audience. Y'all are smart. Eddie always puts half my conversation in chat. So embarrassing. Sorry, Cobra Commander. That's the only problem with me just catching up with the chat, way too late. Or not reading the chat enough. Sometimes I just take people's comments that they made mid conversation. But that was a good comment. So so how is that different from basically saying anyone who opposes America is anti-imperialist? Well, here's what I would say. Everybody who opposes America, who goes towards anti-imperialism, has to do it in an economic way, right? They have to challenge the U.S. economically, because that's what the U.S. wants, is economic control, right? I mean, they'll take political control if they get it, but you could have a socialist government take power and say, I'm a socialist, but then not do anything socialist and just help the empire and help the liberals, sort of like Pedro Castillo in Peru. And the U.S. won't care, right? You can do whatever you want politically as long as you don't interfere in exploitation. So what we've seen is even non-socialist countries like Russia and Iran, who have combated imperialism, their economies end up looking very, very similar to socialist economies. Like most of Iran's banks and their major industry and sectors of economic power are controlled by the state, are controlled by basically the masses, their public. And Iran doesn't allow, usury. They don't allow banks to purposefully trap people in debt to make a profit, which is obviously an enormous problem in America. Everybody's trapped in debt. And then Russia, like we were just talking about, with the nationalization of various sectors of their energy industry and the redistribution of that, right? If Russia wasn't doing that, the U.S. wouldn't be trying to kill them, right? The U.S. wouldn't be trying to overthrow Putin if he didn't nationalize various sectors of the economy that Western multinationals want access to. So in order to be anti-imperialist in reality, materially, you have to move towards socialism, right? And the Communist Party got second in Russia's last elections. We know that they have influence over Putin, as do the communist masses, who now make up a strong voting bloc and who Putin can't win election without. They influence his policy, and even though Russia's not a socialist country, they've gone towards more of a socialist economic system. Because like I said, if you just allow the US to control your economy, one, your people are going to be exploited like crazy, probably threatening revolution because of how exploited and impoverished they are. They're going to be, which is what Russia was like after the fall of the USSR and when the US plundered their economy. You had like 20% unemployment, starvation, mass homelessness, and these were things that didn't even exist under the previous socialist economy that these people were experiencing for the first time. So Putin has sort of rebuilt their economy by moving towards socialism, because the only way to actually combat empire is to move towards socialism. I hope that makes sense. The only way to move, because economics is the basis, or production is the basis of imperialism, and politics is part of the superstructure. A country can't just be politically anti-imperialist, right? There's no reason for a government to just take on the U.S. or, if the U.S. is creating a puppet state like the one in Ukraine, there's no reason for a capitalist government allied with the U.S. or capitalist oligarchs allied with the U.S. oligarchs to invade that country, right? It always comes down to something economic, like Russia wanting control of that port so they can continue with their process of self-development. But imperialism can't allow self-development, so the U.S. is constantly doing more and more and more and more to threaten Russia and bring us closer to nuclear war. The basis of anti-imperialism has to be in production. We have to change things materially. Yeah, thank you. That makes it easier to understand. Thank you for asking such a great question. Much love. What? Putin moved towards socialism? Just with the nationalization of the company. And this is what's so weird, is nobody knows this. Nobody knows this, and there's been so many Marxist analyses of Russia, and they don't even mention the changes in Russia's economy. It's like, this is why the U.S. hates them. If you're going to do a Marxist analysis, you have to talk about production and analyze the economy. And Putin literally wrote his senior thesis on this. He wrote his senior thesis, here's what we can do to fix Russia's economy. Nationalize these sectors, invest over here. And it's not Putin moving towards socialism ideologically, although recently in a meeting with the Communist Party, he did move towards socialism ideologically, saying it's not a bad idea, again showing how, after being a staunch anti-communist before, and they all kind of smiled and laughed, showing how, materially Russia is moving closer to socialism again, which is what scares the U.S., so he is moving towards socialism ideologically a little bit, I guess, but it's not like Putin is saying Russia's socialist now and I'm socialist now and we're going to build communism, right? Which is why we don't just support Putin, and think Putin and Russia's leader is the best. We support the Russian masses as we support the Ukrainian masses in their struggle towards socialism. But yeah, Putin nationalized major sectors of Russia's economy that had been neoliberalized or privatized with the fall of the USSR and the Western companies' plunder of Russia. And nobody ever talks about that. It's like, why do you think NATO and the US hate Putin and Russia so much? Right? Why do you think just out of nowhere they started trying to cook up a brand new Cold War against Russia and China? It's because Russia and China are not doing what the US wants economically, which is what gets you targeted by imperialism. The state also has control of 40% of the business. Look at China, how much we praise them. They have 60% ownership. So it's not as oligarchic as the U.S. wants you to believe. Thank you, Cobra Commander. Great statistic, and I'm going to use that going forward. 40% of their business. I mean, by example, and everybody knows I'm as big of a Venezuela supporter as you can be. Venezuela's economy is something like 17% nationalized. It's probably more than that now. But it's, mostly the oil sector, also telecommunications, aluminum, some other strategic sectors of the economy, but not the whole economy. I think Venezuela actually technically has less nationalized economy than France, a capitalist country, but that doesn't mean Venezuela is not socialist. They are socialist. They're ideologically socialist, and they're constructing socialism based on their own unique conditions. You can't just compare them to France and say France has more public infrastructure or whatever, public industry, so therefore France is socialist and Venezuela is not. That's not how it works. But if you look at what Russia's doing materially, again, 40% of business is state-owned. And that's, after the dissolution of the USSR, pretty much all their state-owned industries, like I said, were plundered by the US or sold off at pennies by the actual corrupt oligarchs who were running Russia then. Think what you want of Putin. He's done a lot to crack down on those oligarchs and nationalize major sectors of Russia's economy. Made it look much more like state capitalism, I guess. Unless Putin wears a Soviet lapel pin. No socialism, bro. LOL. Okay, but Eddie, both CNN and MSNBC have repeatedly explained that we here in the US hate Russia because they're the bad guys. How do you explain that? A very good point. One sec. I have where is this? Oh, I can't find it. Well, there was some German newscaster who was talking about Russia and the war with Russia. And they basically said this, which I have a poster of Rocky IV on my door, which I should probably bring that down because it's the most anti-communist, anti-Russia movie I've ever seen. I watched it a lot as a kid growing up. And it did make me literally have internalized like fear and dislike of Russia, which is why the DOD and the U.S. imperialists spent so much money controlling Hollywood and entertainment. Check out our old video on entertainment media and imperialism. But anyways, along with all the media and the entertainment that makes us hate Russia, there was a German newscaster who was talking about the war, and they said, we need to remember Russia's not like the rest of Europe, right? They don't have the same level of civilization and the same values. They're different, right? Which is just blatantly xenophobic. Basically just using xenophobia, they're different than us, to justify imperialism. Just bold-faced. But I mean, that's what imperialism is usually based on. They're usually, more covert with the way that they say it. The modern empire will be like, the US will be like, we're woke and this country's not woke, so we need to invade them for women's rights. Or back in the day, or not back in the day, still, their human rights are bad. Our human rights are good. We don't have to explain materially what that means, but let's go get them. It's just value-based imperialism. And it was really interesting to hear a German newscaster say the quiet part out loud. We're different from Russia. They're bad guys. They're uncivilized. We need to attack them. Like, way to bring out the old school European racism, like the old school like IQ race theory, scientific racism. The German newscasters are like, let's bring that back. They said the same things about Vietnamese and Iraqis, that they intrinsically don't value their own lives. Yes, they'll do this with socialist countries. They'll be like, well, and especially countries in the East, because countries in the East are more collectively minded versus the West is more individualistic, which if you learn about the cultural differences in the US, they'll tell you that countries in the East are more authoritarian, but they're actually just more collectively minded. So the US media, especially during Iraq and Vietnam, would literally be like, they don't value life as much as us Americans. They don't value life the same way we do in civilized society. They live in these collective societies, and because they work together and, cooperate more than we do in the US, this individualistic American dream BS, capitalist, imperialist hellhole, because they work together and cooperate, they don't actually even value their lives. So it's just totally okay to kill them for plundering their resources. Just the most insane insane arguments, xenophobic arguments. Jacob sent, speaking of Rocky, this is the original ending of Rambo. I know exactly what this is. I know exactly what you just sent me, but I'm going to pull it up for everyone. I know what it is before I even open it. Shout out to those brave Mujahideen warriors, right? One sec, opening it up here. There it is. This is the ending credit for the 1988 American movie Rambo 3, in which Sylvester Stallone goes to Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen against Soviet Russia. After 9/11 in 2001, the ending credit was later changed to the gallant people of Afghanistan. This film is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan. So they were willing to support the funding and arming of Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen when it was to fight the Soviets. You know, they were okay with the U.S. giving a bunch of weapons to terrorists when it was to fight the Soviets. But when those terrorists turned around and, you know, attacked the World Trade Centers on 9/11, oh, now these are the bad guys. Like, if they were the bad guys, why did you give them all this arms and funding? And of course, for anyone who knows the history of Afghanistan, it was not the Soviet Union who the U.S. funded and armed the Mujahideen to fight. Right? The democratic government of social reformers, of left-wing progressives in Afghanistan, who was coming to power, requested that the Soviets enter their country 10 times. They requested Soviet help against the extremist groups who were increasingly being funded and armed by the Americans 10 times. Very similar to Donetsk and Lugansk in the Donbass in Russia, where they asked Russia to help them 10 times before Russia actually did. But this democratic government of social reformers in Afghanistan had been building for a while, have been developing for a while. There's a rich history of social reform in the left-wing movement for left-wing economics and major social reforms in favor of, you know, women's rights and things like this. That's what the government who came to power in Afghanistan when the U.S. invaded, or when they funded the Mujahideen, which we now call the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that's who had come to power. And the Soviets went in to help build hospitals and help build roads and try and fight against the extremist groups like the Mujahideen being armed and funded by the U.S. in order to protect this newly democratic and socialistic government. But the extremist groups, with their machine guns and bombs and funding from the U.S., ended up being too powerful. Were able to topple the Afghanistan government. And then what's insane is not only did years later the Mujahideen attack the U.S. In New York with the weapons this group we had funded and armed, splintered off into Al Qaeda and ISIS, I believe, and then Al Qaeda, as far as we know, or as far as I know, carried out the 9/11 attack. So not only that, but then in 2001, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. So we armed and funded these terrorists who took out the progressive social reformers. Then they attacked the U.S., the terrorists we were funding. So we invaded and occupied them to fight the terrorists. If these terrorists are so bad, and if we need to invade and occupy their country in order to defeat them, why did we give them so many weapons and so much money when there was a democratic government trying to take power and enact social reforms? Oh, it was to fight it was to fight socialism and the Soviet Union, and really to control the economy of Afghanistan. Because they knew with that democratic leftist government, there were going to be land reforms. There were going to be agricultural reforms. There was going to be nationalization of industry, redistribution, economic construction. And the U.S. didn't want that. They wanted to control Afghanistan like a colony, which is exactly what they did after invading in 2001, occupying the country. And now we're finding out, with investigations into the U.S. occupation, literal U.S. government or U.S. military officials in Afghanistan were just making tons and tons of money selling opium or selling saffron, selling minerals on the black market. So it wasn't even American corporations who were making a ton of money off Afghanistan. It was literally being run by like a neo-colony or a feudal colony where the U.S. Military bases serve as the feudal lords, harvesting opium and things like that for their illegal sale on the black market. And Afghani opium is the number one source of heroin. So heroin was being produced and making a bunch of money for corrupt people within the U.S. military. Finding out that they were selling saffron and opium. What else was I gonna say? Oh yeah, and then it was making a bunch of money for the weapons contractors, right? They were constantly keeping the fighting going on purpose in Afghanistan so they could keep selling them weapons. So it was just a giant money maker, big money pit for the weapons contractors and whoever happened to be stationed there in charge of a base that was basically a base running like a feudal colony. And does anybody, how the hell can you look at Afghanistan, look at Joe Biden leaving in 2022 or 2021, whatever it was, leaving the Taliban in power, right? And now sanctioning Afghanistan and holding them under a economic siege, which is expected to lead to 22 million people facing malnutrition is what the U.S. sanctions are supposed to cause. How can you look at that and be like, yeah, we brought them freedom and democracy? Yeah, the U.S. is doing what they say around the world. They're protecting human rights. Because as we've been talking about, imperialism is an economic system. So, the U.S. distracts by saying that all their motivations are political, right? Oh, the Soviet Union's trying to take over Afghanistan. They're trying to take over their government. We need to invade and stop them from doing that. And then, we need to invade to protect human rights. And the Mujahideen's in charge of Afghanistan now. Forget about the part where we funded and armed them. They attacked us on 9/11. Let's go get them for human rights. And now let's sanction the Afghani people and force 22 million people into malnutrition for human rights. Of course, these things don't protect human rights because these things aren't necessarily political. They're economic. The U.S. wants to make a bunch of money selling weapons in Afghanistan. And, they want to make a bunch of money off the opium trade. There is oil in Afghanistan, although not a whole lot. Same thing with like Iraq. They didn't care about Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein did kill and torture people. He could be called an autocrat. The U.S. did not care about that. They allied with Saddam Hussein a few years earlier when it was convenient. It's all about the money. It's all about the economics. And that's how you can have a disaster like Afghanistan, where for 40 years, the U.S. has been telling us we're helping bring them human rights. And the U.S. has consistently destabilized and destroyed Afghanistan, holding them in poverty and backing the worst extremist terrorist groups, and still pretend like we're fighting for human rights. I guess that's how you can have a situation on the ground and a situation in reality that is so much different from what the U.S. says they're going to do. It's because the U.S. just focuses on politics. We're bringing them human rights. We're bringing them our values. We got to topple their government. It's a bad government. When really it's economic control of territory. America won't bite Saudi Arabia's hand, the hand that feeds. True. That's the biggest example of capitalist projection. The U.S. talking about Iran being the state sponsor of terrorism or whatever, while funding Saudi Arabia. Well, folks, I think I'm gonna call it a day here because I'm pretty tired. I will save my talk about export capital for later. I just realized I've been going for 3 hours and 15 minutes. I told my girlfriend it was going to be a short stream today, and I ended up going 3 hours and 15 minutes. So I better go text her, probably asleep, but oh well. Thank you all for the great stream. This was really, really fun. I would love some feedback, especially in the YouTube comments. If you can give us some feedback, what did you like? What didn't you like? Do you want me to break down more theory? Do you want me to go chapter by chapter? Do you want me to go faster? Do you want me to go slower? Do you want me to use more examples from relevant or that are relevant today? Let me know. And yeah, keep educating, keep organizing, keep learning yourself. We're all in this together, and we're going to make a better world. Yeah. And you can support us on Patreon if you want at Midwestern Marx. Otherwise, like, comment, subscribe. That helps boost us in the algorithm. Much love, y'all. Couldn't do it without you. Couldn't do it without your support. Love interacting with y'all during these streams. So tell your friends.